Good evening, friends. Tonight, we journey not into the flames of battle or the chambers of kings, but into something quieter and far more dangerous. We will explore the long, slow unraveling of wealth, trust, and balance. This is the story of how ancient empires went bankrupt. It did not always begin with conquest. Some empires fell while their cities still glittered, while palaces stood tall, while the gold still shimmered in vaults, though no one could buy a loaf of bread. Economic collapse doesn't cry out like war. It whispers. It creeps in through drought and debt, through crumbling roads and unpaid soldiers, through corruption, excess, and the slow, silent betrayal of coin and promise. This is the kind of fall that is not written in blood, but in grain receipts, in tax rolls, in hollow treasuries, and hungry children. In tonight's story, we will drift softly across centuries and empires. We'll walk through the buzzing marketplaces of Babylon, where clay tablets track debts older than writing itself. We'll count coins in an Athenian treasury, watching them dwindle, as war eats the wealth of democracy. We'll sit beside a Roman tax collector whose scrolls stretch longer than his reach. And we'll stand among the silent ruins of golden Baghdad, where once the richest city on earth stood proud, and now dust drifts through broken courtyards. Empires are built on many things, on armies, on law, on belief. But beneath them all lies economy. Rain to feed the people, able to mint the coin, labor to plant and to build, trust in the system. And when that trust dies, no sword, no crown, no prayer can save it. Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet walks through forgotten worlds, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time you usually fall asleep. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, take a deep breath, let the world fade, and settle in. We're about to follow the trail of silver as it vanishes into dust and discover what truly happens when the money runs out. The story of economic collapse begins in one of the oldest civilizations humanity ever built, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here, thousands of years before the birth of coins, currency existed in the form of grain, livestock, and labor. And in the midst of clay tablets and irrigation canals, the earliest symptoms of economic strain quietly took root. The Babylonian economy was a marvel of its time. It relied heavily on agriculture, with fields fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The fertility of the floodplains made this land one of abundance, but also of deep dependence. The state tracked everything through an intricate system of record-keeping. Scribes etched financial transactions onto clay tablets, storing debts, taxes, and property transfers like an ancient bureaucracy. In Babylonian society, grain was both sustenance and money. It was stored in large communal granaries overseen by priests and administrators. Workers could be paid in grain, and families borrowed grain during hard seasons, with the promise of repayment at harvest. In prosperous times, the system worked smoothly, but prosperity was fragile. Mesopotamia's fields, overworked for generations, began to show signs of soil salinization. Irrigation, once a gift of life, became a source of decline. Salt built up in the fields, lowering crop yields year after year. Farmers struggled to produce enough grain to pay back their debts, triggering a rise in default and economic tension. This led to one of the oldest documented economic crises in history, debt servitude. Those who could not repay grain or labor debts could lose their land, or even their children, to bondage. A father could be forced to hand over a son as a servant to a creditor. A widow might lose her home and livestock. The economy turned cruel not with war, but with weight of obligation. Even temple estates, large, wealthy landowners, were affected. As smaller farms failed, temples absorbed more land, creating concentrated wealth in fewer hands. The divide between elite and laborer widened, and when elites hoarded grain during bad harvests, prices soared beyond reach for the poor. The kings tried to respond. Hammurabi, ruler of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, is most remembered for his law code, but he was also one of history's earliest economic reformers. He issued what we might call a debt jubilee, canceling personal debts and releasing people from debt servitude. It was a bold gesture of mercy and necessity. Without it, civil unrest would have boiled over. But these jubilees were not systemic fixes. They were emergency resets, wiping the slate only after the damage had been done. The records from that period reflect both bureaucracy and desperation. One tablet reads, "To the household of Synedinum, a loan of barley shall be repaid within 1 moon. Failure shall be met with forfeiture of field and tools." Another lists an entire family transferred to a creditor. 3 sons and 1 daughter pledged to the estate of the Temple of Marduk until repayment is made. Debt had become more than a financial condition. It was a chain, legally binding bodies, generations, and futures. Alongside the economic downturn came political weakness. As small villages fell behind on grain quotas, the central government lost influence. Trade with neighboring regions declined, further tightening the spiral. Foreign invasions, once held at bay by taxes and grain-funded armies, became harder to resist. And as people moved to cities in search of protection or food, the urban centers swelled. But the granaries no longer held enough. Markets in Babylon, once vibrant and busy, grew quiet. Prices rose. Trust in temple accountants and royal scribes eroded. The famine in the countryside could turn into a riot in the city. By the time the Kassites swept into Babylon, the kingdom was no longer economically resilient. The central government could no longer enforce fair collection. Clay tablets stopped being symbols of order and became evidence of systemic failure. Mesopotamia's story teaches us that even the earliest civilizations had to grapple with the fundamentals of supply, credit, and class division. Their failure wasn't due to ignorance, it was due to scale and overconfidence. They created systems too rigid to bend when times grew hard. The very tools that made Babylon powerful, the centralized grain economy, the temple bureaucracy, the debt-led labor system, also ensured that when cracks formed, they spread fast. And beneath the impressive walls and temple ziggurats, it was always the ordinary people who bore the cost. Debt, in ancient Mesopotamia, did more than bind one individual to another, it echoed through generations. A father's failed harvest could place his children's future in servitude. The Babylonian concept of economic obligation was not limited to gold or coin. It was grounded in land, labor, and time. Time was often the most painful payment. As fields deteriorated and labor demands grew, families without resources were forced into debt bondage, not unlike slavery in function. These individuals were not owned outright, but were bound to work off loans under punishing conditions. Some remained in this state for life. For those in bondage, freedom was always conditional, at the mercy of the next good harvest or the benevolence of a ruler. And rulers grew less generous as crises mounted. Debt amnesties became rarer, or more politically charged. Even more disturbing was how this system of economic collapse bled into justice. Court tablets from later Babylonian periods show cases where landowners used debt claims to seize land from rivals. False accusations of non-payment were levied against poor neighbors, often upheld by temple scribes who stood to benefit. The system bent not just under financial weight, but under the corruption of those who recorded it. The tablets, often seen as artifacts of knowledge, also became symbols of abuse and inequality. In a society where nearly all agreements were written, illiterate farmers or laborers were deeply disadvantaged. If a scribe misrecorded or deliberately altered a contract, the common man had almost no recourse. Thus, economic collapse was also epistemic. The control of information by a few allowed them to concentrate power and survive while others perished. And yet, even in collapse, the city of Babylon kept functioning. In form, if not in substance. Temples still held ceremonies, markets still open, clay tablets were still filed, but the energy had shifted. trade routes once vibrant with tin, lapis lazuli, and cedar slowed, fewer merchant caravans arrived. Foreign traders reported higher tariffs and unreliable weights. Foreign embassies, often gifted fine Babylonian textiles, now received less valuable goods, or nothing at all. In these subtle shifts, the empire's economic decay became visible from afar. Diplomatic letters found in Amarna, Egypt from Babylonian kings pleading for gifts and dowries revealed desperation. One writes, "Send me much gold. My palace needs gold, as dust needs wind." Poetic turn of phrase, but one that masks the emptiness behind the grandeur. Back home, laborers abandoned farms and moved to the cities, hoping to become servants, guards, or petty merchants, but cities had no jobs for them. Homelessness and begging became common. Prostitution, always present, rose to new heights, a painful marker of economic collapse. The empire began to privatize its last strengths. Large landowners absorbed farmland and hoarded surplus. They created informal militias to protect their stores from hungry crowds. What had once been centralized state control dissolved into feudal fragments, ruled not by royal command, but by who had food, guards, and grain ledgers. Religious institutions played a complex role in this. Temples, once the central banks of Mesopotamia, became more insular. They continued their rituals, but their focus turned inward. Some began charging exorbitant interest on grain loans. Others protected elites while turning away common petitioners. It is in this moment that one sees the deeper meaning of economic collapse. Not simply a lack of money, but the loss of shared systems, the evaporation of trust, and the hardening of human hearts. Eventually, the external blow came, as it always does. Nomadic groups from the Zagros Mountains, sensing the weakness of Babylon, pushed south. They found cities half abandoned, guards unpaid, gates unmaintained. They did not need to conquer with fire. Babylon had already burned itself from within, slowly, silently. And so fell one of history's oldest powers. Not with thunder, but with ledgers gone dry, fields gone white with salt, and clay tablets too brittle to hold a civilization together. Mesopotamia taught the world how to write, how to govern, and how to account. But it also taught a painful truth. Even the mightiest systems crumble when the economy beneath them is ignored. And in the ruins of Babylon's ziggurats, among thousands of clay decks still buried in the earth, we find not just a fallen empire, but a mirror. Now we leave the dusty plains of Mesopotamia behind and sail across the bright Aegean Sea, toward a new civilization whose glory still echoes in stone and story, ancient Greece. A land of philosophers and poets, of shining temples and olive groves, but also a land driven and ultimately burdened by economic ambition and exploitation. Greece was never a single empire. It was a web of city-states, poleis, each with its own government, military, and economy. But among them, Athens stood out, not only for its art and democracy, but for its wealth. Athens had two great treasures. One lay above the city, the temples of the Acropolis, crowned by the Parthenon. The other lay beneath the earth, the silver mines of Laurion. It was this silver, mined by enslaved laborers in brutal underground shafts, that funded the Athenian fleet, paid the city's workers, and filled its treasury. With this wealth, Athens flourished in the 5th century BCE. But silver, like grain in Babylon, is not infinite. And economies built on the backs of slaves and war loot cannot last forever. Athens' golden age began in earnest after the Persian Wars, when the city led the Delian League, an alliance of Greek states ostensibly formed for mutual defense. But over time, Athens treated it less like an alliance and more like a source of tribute. City-states across the Aegean sent Athens money, ostensibly for fleet maintenance, but much of it went to pay for marble statues, festivals, and public works. The League treasury was even moved from the island of Delos to Athens, a bold sign that Athens no longer shared power. It had become an empire in all but name. And this empire consumed silver at an astonishing rate. The wealth fueled a vibrant city, artists were paid, jurors received wages, and craftsmen thrived, but the economy grew increasingly dependent on external income, mines, tributes, and trade. Internally, cracks began to form, and most of the agricultural land around Athens was controlled by wealthy landowners. Small farmers struggled, especially in lean years, often falling into debt. The city's food needs far outpaced its own production, making Athens heavily dependent on imported grain, particularly from the Black Sea region. That dependency would become a critical weakness. Then came the Peloponnesian War, a long, brutal conflict between Athens and its rival Sparta. It lasted nearly 3 decades, from 431 to 404 BCE, and reshaped the Greek world. War devastated the countryside. Farms were burned, slaves fled, and trade routes became battlegrounds. The Athenian fleet, once mighty, drained the treasury as battles dragged on. The silver mines at Laurion were temporarily lost, and slave laborers either escaped or died. Revenue plummeted. To fund the war, Athens imposed heavier taxes on its allies, deepening resentment and triggering revolts. The economy, once built on tribute and control, turned on itself. Inflation rose. The value of silver dropped. Supplies ran short. Public works stalled. And the once proud city, unable to feed its people or pay its soldiers, began to collapse inward. The psychological toll of this economic erosion is preserved in the writings of the time. The playwright Aristophanes, in his comedies, mocked politicians for empty promises and corruption. The historian Thucydides described how the war had stripped Athens not only of money, but of its moral compass. In his words, "War is a violent teacher." The streets of Athens, once filled with debate and theater, now echoed with the complaints of veterans, beggars, and angry merchants. Many small landowners, already weakened by debt, lost their property entirely and fell into poverty. The state's attempts to stabilize the situation included confiscation, emergency taxes, and borrowing from sacred treasuries. But these were short-term measures. They didn't fix the deeper issue, a broken economic foundation. The social strain reached a breaking point. Class divisions widened. The aristocrats who controlled shipping and estates remained powerful, while common citizens bore the weight of taxes and food shortages, and democracy itself began to falter under the stress. In 411 BCE and again in 404 BCE, oligarchic coups briefly overthrew democratic rule. Economic desperation led citizens to trade freedom for promises of order, a haunting pattern repeated throughout history. By the war's end, Athens was militarily defeated, politically shaken, and economically hollowed out. It had lost not just its empire, but the system that made its grandeur possible. In the decades following the Peloponnesian War, Athens struggled to recover. Though it rebuilt its walls and navy, the old economic confidence was gone. The silver mines of Laurion, once the backbone of Athenian finance, never returned to their full productivity. Many of the enslaved laborers had fled or died. Those who remained were often too few, too old, or too expensive to replace. Athens tried to revive trade. Merchant ships once again sailed toward the Black Sea, bringing in grain and luxury goods. But now, Athens was no longer the dominant naval power. Its control of trade routes had weakened. Taxes on foreign merchants increased to fill the treasury, but these fees drove trade away. The city grew increasingly dependent on wealthy benefactors. Elite citizens expected to sponsor festivals, fund ships, or pay for repairs. These contributions, known as liturgies, had once been acts of pride. Now they became resentful obligations, and many elites used their political influence to avoid them altogether. In this environment, corruption festered. Public officials, once selected by lot to promote fairness, were now easily bought or intimidated. Tax collection became inconsistent. Some regions were overtaxed, others evaded taxes entirely, and the state grew weaker with every missed payment. By the mid-4th century BCE, Athens faced a different threat: Macedon. Under King Philip II and later his son Alexander the Great, Macedon had become a military and economic powerhouse. Unlike the fractured city-states of southern Greece, Macedon centralized its finances, land, and army. While Athens clung to the past, Macedon planned for the future. Athens tried to resist. Orators like Demosthenes warned of Macedonian domination. They called for reforms, alliances, and military preparedness. But the money wasn't there. The state was too dependent on its navy, and its navy was smaller, older, and less disciplined than before. In 331 BCE, Athens and its allies were defeated at the Battle of Chaeronea. Macedon now controlled most of Greece. So the final blow to Athenian economic independence came not through invasion, but through irrelevance. Alexander's conquests shifted the economic center of the Greek world eastward, to Babylon, Susa, and eventually Alexandria in Egypt. New trade routes, new coinage systems, and new markets emerged, leaving Athens in their wake. Even as philosophers still debated in the agora, and drama continued on its stages, Athens had become, in economic terms, a peripheral city, glorious in name, but hollow in power. Yet Athens was not alone. Many other city-states in Greece followed a similar trajectory. Initial wealth from trade or war, growing dependence on tribute or imports, and eventual collapse under internal inequality and external pressure. Corinth, once wealthy from trade, lost its prominence after Roman conquest. Thebes, which tried to challenge Macedon, was razed and rebuilt. Delphi, guardian of the oracle and recipient of vast temple offerings, saw its wealth drained by political demands. The story of Greek economic collapse was one of many small deaths, not a single catastrophe. One by one, cities lost their independence, not just politically, but financially. And it all began with systems that rewarded conquest, ignored the poor, and forgot that prosperity must be nurtured, not consumed. Athens had once funded democracy with silver and ambition. But without justice, sustainability, and foresight, that wealth became sand in the wind. By the time the Romans arrived in the 2nd century BCE, Greece was no longer a rival. It was a treasure trove of art, knowledge, and unpaid debts. And the marble temples that still stand today? They are not just monuments to beauty. They are tombstones for an economy that failed to adapt. The Roman Empire rose on the promise of order, strength, and endless expansion. Its armies marched farther than any had before, its roads stitched continents together, and its economy became the envy of the known world. At its peak, Rome ruled from the misty isles of Britain to the sands of Arabia, a dominion upheld by coin, conquest, and control. But beneath the marble forums and golden eagles, Rome's economic engine bore heavy strain. Its collapse, like many great powers before it, came not from one blow but from a long, grinding economic decay that touched everything from the Senate to the street vendor. It began, as so many things do in empires, with conquest. During the Republic and early imperial period, Rome's economy was supercharged by war. Newly conquered territories brought in wealth, gold, silver, grain, livestock, and most critically, slaves. Enslaved people became the backbone of Roman agriculture and industry. They worked the vast latifundia, enormous estates owned by wealthy elites, producing wine, oil, and wheat for export. This created a paradox. The richer Rome became, the more dependent it grew on conquest. War was not only patriotic, it was profitable. And for a while it worked. The state filled its treasury with spoils, taxed new provinces, and distributed free grain to urban citizens to maintain peace. But eventually, the empire ran out of easy conquests. The borders hardened. The wars became costlier, bloodier, and far less rewarding. Meanwhile, the internal economy began to show cracks. Small farmers, once the backbone of the Republic, were pushed out by slave-run estates. Many moved to cities like Rome, where they joined the swelling population of landless poor, dependent on state handouts. The grain dole, free or subsidized food for citizens, became a political necessity to prevent unrest. But it also placed a massive burden on the treasury. The Roman government increasingly relied on taxation to fund these services. But taxation was not equal. The elite, often senators and equestrians, used their influence to avoid or minimize taxes. The middle classes, merchants, and provincial landowners bore the brunt. And in the provinces, corruption made things worse. Tax collectors, known as publicani, were often private contractors who paid the state in advance for the right to collect taxes. They would then extract as much as possible from local populations, frequently far more than was owed, to turn a profit. These practices choked provincial economies, leading to resentment and rebellion. The empire also struggled with its monetary system. Initially, Roman currency was relatively stable. The aureus gold coin and denarius silver coin were trusted and widely accepted throughout the empire. Trade flowed easily. Merchants could move from Syria to Gaul without ever changing money. But as military expenses grew, especially defending vast borders against Germanic tribes, Parthians, and internal usurpers, the empire began to debase its currency. The silver content of the denarius declined steadily. Under Emperor Nero, it was reduced slightly. Under later emperors, it plummeted. By the 3rd century CE, the denarius was little more than a bronze disc with a silver wash. Trust in Roman money collapsed. Prices rose rapidly. Soldiers demanded payment in goods or gold. Merchants refused imperial coinage. Inflation spiraled. The Roman state responded by minting more money, further lowering its value. A cycle had begun. Military pressure, more coinage, inflation, tax shortfalls, more debasement. By the time of Emperor Diocletian, the situation was dire. Diocletian tried to restore order through sweeping reforms. He restructured the empire, creating the Tetrarchy, ruled by 4 emperors, attempted to freeze prices with his edict on maximum prices, and overhauled taxation. But his price controls failed. Merchants could not cover costs, black markets flourished, and punishments for violating the edict, including death, only drove the economy further underground. Taxation reforms led to the binding of peasants to their land, a precursor to medieval serfdom. They could not leave, and their taxes were hereditary. It stabilized revenue, but at a terrible human cost. Meanwhile, Diocletian's attempt to restore monetary stability fell short. His new gold coin, the solidus, eventually brought some balance under Constantine, but the empire had already fractured. The West struggled to recover. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was bankrupt in all but name. By the time the Western Roman Empire reached the 5th century, the economic structure had decayed beyond repair. The weight of centuries of military overspending, currency debasement, and widening inequality was no longer possible to hold up with reforms or imperial decrees. Rome was living on borrowed time and borrowed gold. A particularly telling symptom of this decay was the collapse of urban trade. Roman cities had once been bustling centers of commerce, fed by roads, ports, and a uniform monetary system. But by the 400 CE, local economies were retreating into self-sufficiency. Roads were poorly maintained. Coinage was mistrusted. In some provinces, especially in Gaul and Britain, barter replaced money altogether. Merchants no longer trusted imperial currency. Instead, transactions occurred in grain, livestock, or locally minted coins of dubious value. As the imperial administration lost its grip, local elites took control, collecting taxes, maintaining order, and negotiating with outside threats. The empire was fragmenting, not politically first, but economically. One reason for this was the Roman military's insatiable need for resources. Soldiers had to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid. In times of crisis, emperors lavished troops with donatives, large cash gifts, to secure loyalty. But as the treasury emptied, they often resorted to promising land or supplies instead of money. These promises, rarely fulfilled, created bitterness and betrayal. Whole legions deserted or mutinied. Border defenses crumbled, not just from outside attack, but from financial starvation. The burden fell heavily on the peasantry. Under the Annona system, rural producers were obligated to supply grain and other goods to the army and state. What was once a tax became an extraction system. In many regions, peasants abandoned land rather than meet impossible quotas. Fields went fallow, villages emptied. Rome could no longer feed itself. Meanwhile, aristocrats hoarded wealth, their villas grew more fortified, many withdrew from public life, refusing to serve in government or pay fair taxes. The social contract between elites and the empire, once strong, began to unravel. Even in the capital, signs of decay mounted. The Roman Forum, once the vibrant center of public and economic life, grew quiet. Statues were looted for bronze, fountains ran dry. The empire could no longer afford basic maintenance, let alone new construction. The symbol of Roman glory stood, but hollowed out. Religious institutions filled some of the gaps. The Christian Church, now dominant after Constantine, provided some charity and infrastructure, but it could not replace an imperial economy, and it too soon accumulated vast, untaxed wealth, further straining the fiscal balance. One by one, western provinces were lost. Britain was abandoned in 410 CE, left to defend itself. Gaul fragmented under Germanic tribes and local warlords. Spain fell into chaos. And North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was seized by the Vandals, cutting off vital grain supplies to Italy. Rome itself was sacked in 410 CE by the Visigoths, and again in 455 CE by the Vandals. But these invasions were not just military acts. They were symptoms of an empire already economically hollowed out. By the time Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, was deposed in 476 CE, the empire was no longer an empire. It was a series of disconnected territories, economically isolated and politically fractured. And yet, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived. Why? The East had richer provinces, especially Egypt and Anatolia. It had more stable tax systems, a better maintained bureaucracy, and access to key trade routes. And most importantly, it preserved confidence in its coinage, particularly the solidus, which became the gold standard for centuries. The East learned from the West's mistakes, at least for a time. But in the West, Rome's downfall was an economic implosion, masked by marble and memory. The empire had stopped functioning long before the final fall. It had become a ghost, walking in golden sandals, held together by inertia. The lesson of Rome's economy is not just about currency or taxes. It's about the consequences of ignoring the people who hold it all up. The small farmers, the merchants, the craftsmen, the soldiers, the scribes. When their trust in the system vanished, so too did the empire. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled into dust and memory, its eastern half endured. Reforged as Byzantium, a glittering Christian empire ruled from the golden throne of Constantinople. The Byzantines called themselves Romans, and for 1,000 years, they stood as a bastion of classical inheritance, administrative genius, and economic resilience. At its height, the Byzantine Empire controlled vast stretches of land from the Balkans to the Levant. But unlike its Western predecessor, its true strength was not in its legions or roads, but in its coinage, bureaucracy, and tax system. The Byzantines created one of the most sophisticated economic machines in the medieval world. Yet for all its brilliance, this economy too would rot from within. The empire would not collapse in one swift blow, but diminish gradually, as economic inefficiencies, military disasters, and foreign invasions hollowed it out from century to century. The gold standard, the solidus. For nearly 7 centuries, the Byzantine economy was anchored by one of history's most stable currencies, the gold solidus. Minted first by Constantine in the 4th century, the solidus remained consistent in weight and purity until the late 11th century, an almost unmatched achievement in monetary history. Merchants across Europe, the Islamic world, and even Asia trusted the solidus. It was accepted in bazaars, ports, and palaces alike. This currency stability gave Byzantium enormous financial credibility. Taxes could be collected reliably, soldiers and officials paid, and foreign powers impressed or bribed with hard currency. Unlike the Western Romans, who fell into inflation and debasement, The Byzantines maintained tight control over their mints and punished counterfeiting harshly. Yet even this golden foundation would eventually falter, as we will see. Bureaucracy as an economic engine. The Byzantine Empire is often caricatured as a bloated bureaucracy. And in some ways, that's true. Its imperial administration was vast, its procedures complex, and its court ceremonies elaborate. But this was also its greatest economic strength. Land was surveyed and recorded with astonishing precision. Taxes were assessed based on productivity, not simply ownership. The themes, military districts that doubled as fiscal units, allowed for both defense and revenue collection in tandem. Provincial governors were monitored. Fiscal records were maintained in Greek and Latin. Specialized departments handled trade tariffs, ship maintenance, and granary stocks. The result was a resilient economic system that could absorb shock. When plague struck or a province rebelled, other regions picked up the slack. When trade dipped in one port, another might thrive. And for centuries, this system worked. Constantinople, the heart of empire. No city better symbolized Byzantine prosperity than Constantinople. Strategically placed between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Aegean, it was the crossroads of the medieval world. Its harbors teemed with ships, its warehouses with spices, silks, grain, and gold. The state regulated trade closely. Merchants were required to register, taxes were levied at city gates, and certain goods, especially luxury items, were subject to imperial monopolies. The empire's control of the silk industry, inherited from silkworms from China in the 6th century, became a lucrative state secret. The government also maintained massive grain stores, both for feeding the capital and as a hedge against famine. Subsidized bread, a legacy of Roman times, was distributed to the urban poor. This not only maintained social order, but reinforced loyalty to the emperor. The emperor's face appeared on coins, mosaics, banners, and edicts. He was both spiritual protector and fiscal administrator, the guarantor of divine order and economic survival. Challenges emerge. Despite its strength, the Byzantine economy faced constant challenges. First were external pressures. The empire was under near constant military threat from Sassanids, Arabs, Slavs, Bulgars, Normans, and Turks. Defending long borders drained the treasury. Wars meant more taxes. Campaigns disrupted farming and trade. Every military setback required financial improvisation, new levies, land confiscations, or devaluation. Second was internal corruption. By the 10th century, large landowners, often generals or court elites, had begun to accumulate vast estates. These dynatoid, powerful ones, forged documents or imperial favor to evade taxes and absorb peasant holdings. This led to a shrinking tax base and a loss of smallholder independence. The state responded with laws, such as those of Emperor Romanus I and Basil II, aimed at breaking up estates or protecting peasant lands. But enforcement was inconsistent, especially when emperors needed elite support. Over time, tax revenue declined, forcing the state to raise rates on those still within reach, namely small farmers and urban merchants. The golden solidity of the system began to crack. Currency devaluation and decline. The ultimate economic warning sign arrived in the late 11th century: currency debasement. Under Emperor Alexius I Komnenos, facing military disaster and depleted coffers, the empire was forced to debase the gold solidus, issuing lower purity coins such as the tetarteron and hyperpyron. This shocked markets across the Mediterranean. For centuries, the Byzantine solidus had been a symbol of trust and stability. Its dilution was interpreted not just as a financial decision, but as a loss of imperial credibility. Merchants began demanding foreign currencies, inflation rose, tax assessments became more difficult. The state tried to correct this with new coins, but the damage had been done. The Byzantine economy, once a model of consistency, now joined the familiar trajectory of other empires: currency decay, elite hoarding, tax pressure, and rural flight. By the dawn of the 13th century, The Byzantine economy was no longer the ironclad engine of imperial stability it had once been. The state had survived centuries of external siege and internal decay, but now the fractures were widening. And as ever, it was not one calamity that destroyed Byzantium, but the compounding weight of many: debt, corruption, invasion, and betrayal. At the heart of the empire's final economic downfall was its increasing dependence on foreign powers to supplement its faltering systems. The merchant republics and economic subjugation. In the earlier centuries, Constantinople had dominated Eastern Mediterranean trade. But as the Byzantine fleet shrank and local guilds weakened, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa stepped in. Eager for access to the empire's lucrative ports and grain, these republics negotiated tax exemptions and quartered enclaves in Constantinople. Over time, they gained immense control over shipping, customs, and even security within the empire's walls. The Byzantines, increasingly unable to maintain their own merchant marine or defend sea lanes, became reliant on foreign fleets. Worse still, they extended trading privileges to the Italians not from strength but out of desperation, as payment for military support or loans. Venice in particular became an economic parasite. Its merchants paid no tolls, undercut Byzantine traders, and repatriated profits abroad. The Byzantine treasury, once rich from customs and port fees, found itself hemorrhaging income. The empire had effectively outsourced its maritime economy, a fatal mistake for a polity whose geography and survival had always depended on the sea. The Fourth Crusade, a betrayal fueled by debt. Then came the greatest shock of all, the Fourth Crusade. Originally launched to reclaim the Holy Land, the crusade was diverted to Constantinople in 1204, in part because of Venetian manipulation and Byzantine dynastic politics. The Crusaders sacked the Christian city with ruthless efficiency, looting churches, burning manuscripts, and massacring civilians. Economically, the sack of Constantinople was catastrophic. Its treasures, accumulated over a millennium, were stolen or destroyed. Gold and silver, relics, tapestries, and icons were shipped to Italy, France, and beyond. The city's infrastructure, aqueducts, and ports were damaged. Its bureaucratic apparatus, the lifeblood of its fiscal control, was dismantled. From the ashes rose the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a short-lived and fragile puppet state that could not maintain order or prosperity. The Byzantines fled to Nicaea and Epirus, establishing splinter courts that tried to maintain continuity. Though the Byzantines recaptured the city in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaiologos, it was a hollow victory. The economy had been gutted, and Constantinople was a shell of its former self. Its population decimated, its defenses crumbling, its ports now dominated by Genoese merchants. Tax burden, land loss, and peasant revolt. Back in power but deeply weakened, the Palaeologan dynasty struggled to restore order. With trade revenue lost, the empire turned again to the countryside to squeeze taxes from peasants and landowners alike. But by this point, many smallholders had already lost their land or fled their farms. The countryside was overrun by bandits, unpaid soldiers, and foreign raiders. What land remained productive was increasingly in the hands of the church or aristocracy, both largely exempt from taxation. To compensate, emperors imposed ever higher levies on the remaining peasantry and urban tradesmen. Inflation, fueled by coinage debasement, made matters worse. In many areas, tax collectors were seen less as civil servants than as predators, arriving with threats, confiscations, or forced conscription. Peasant revolts, while often localized, erupted with regularity. So too did factional warfare among aristocrats, weakening any coordinated economic response. The Byzantine state, once famed for its meticulous fiscal registers and rational planning, now operated like a patchwork oligarchy, trying to survive month to month. The Ottomans, and the final economic suffocation. While Byzantium shrank, a new power rose from Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. Initially one of many competing Turkic emirates, the Ottomans expanded rapidly in the 14th century, capturing Bursa, Gallipoli, and Adrianople, Edirne. With every victory, they severed more of Byzantium's revenue streams. By the 15th century, the empire had been reduced to Constantinople and a few scattered holdings. The city was now a shadow of its former self, with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants, many districts abandoned, and trade a pale trickle of what it once was. The emperor's authority was symbolic. The treasury was often empty, and the Ottomans, who encircled the city, imposed tribute and blocked expansion. When Mehmed II launched his final siege in 1453, the Byzantines could barely pay their soldiers or repair their walls. Foreign mercenaries were hired, but supplies were short and morale lower still. The famous double walls that had once turned back Arabs, Bulgars, and Crusaders now stood cracked and undermanned. After 53 days, Constantinople fell. The last emperor, Constantine XI, died sword in hand. Aftermath and historical echoes. The fall of Constantinople marked not just the end of the Byzantine Empire, but the final unraveling of Greco-Roman economic legacy in the East. What had begun as a brilliant system of gold coinage, land registration, maritime commerce, and civil bureaucracy had ended in coinage so debased it was often rejected abroad, tax systems so regressive they inspired revolt, trade so dominated by foreigners that local merchants disappeared, a capital so poor it could not afford to mend its gates. The Ottomans would repopulate and rebuild the city, renaming it Istanbul, and eventually build an empire of their own. But Byzantium, its economy, its administration, its imperial vision, was gone. Its slow decay offers one of the clearest, most enduring examples in history of how economic mismanagement, elite capture, and external dependence can hollow out even the longest-lasting empires. We now cross mountains and deserts into the fertile plains of the Indian subcontinent, where in the 4th century BCE, a new power rose, one of the largest and most centralized empires the East had yet seen. The Mauryan Empire, founded by Chandragupta Maurya, stretched from the Himalayas to the Deccan Plateau, uniting a vast and diverse population under one political banner. It was an empire of roads and edicts, of wealth and walled cities, and behind its monumental reach stood an ambitious economic machine, rich in resources, yet fragile in structure. The Mauryan economy was rooted in agriculture. Fields across the Ganges basin fed cities and garrisons, and state control over land and labor was near absolute. Farmers paid taxes in kind, often up to 1/4 of their produce, to the royal treasury. These taxes supported everything: soldiers, officials, temples, and public works. But agriculture alone could not support a growing empire. The Mauryas turned to mining, metallurgy, and trade to fuel their ambitions. Gold and iron flowed from central India and the Himalayas, smelted and shaped by guilds of specialized artisans. Forests were cleared and elephants captured for labor and war. To manage this vast system, the state built a complex bureaucracy. According to the ancient text Arthashastra, attributed to the minister Chanakya, the empire was governed like a business, with departments for everything: mining, forests, commerce, weights and measures, even espionage. Inspectors collected taxes, monitored markets, and ensured fair trade. There were rules for how merchants could price goods, how laborers were paid, and how stolen property should be returned. The economy was deeply regulated, its flows tracked by a class of educated scribes. At its peak, under Ashoka the Great, the empire enjoyed stability, prosperity, and an active foreign trade network. Goods like spices, textiles, ivory, and semi-precious stones flowed westward toward Persia and Greece, and eastward toward Southeast Asia and China. In return, the empire imported horses, gold, wine, and fine cloth. Trade caravans moved along well-patrolled routes. Ports along the Indian Ocean received ships from far-off lands. Taxes on these goods enriched the imperial treasury, allowing Ashoka to expand roads, dig wells, and build hospitals. And yet, the very size and complexity of this system would become its weakness. A centrally controlled economy relies on constant information flow. But in the Mauryan Empire, communication across vast regions was slow. Reports from distant provinces could take weeks to arrive. Corruption became common, tax collectors skimming grain, local governors hiding revenues, merchants underreporting sales. The Arthashastra itself devotes entire sections to how to catch corrupt officials, a telling sign of how deep the problem ran. Moreover, the imperial system was top-heavy. A vast number of officials and soldiers had to be maintained, all paid by taxes from the rural poor. During times of drought or war, these tax obligations became unbearable. In response, peasants fled their lands, abandoned farms, or revolted. As fields went unplanted, grain production dropped. The treasury strained to keep up with military costs, salaries, and infrastructure. Even worse, the empire's dependence on state-managed trade left little room for local initiative. Guilds were heavily monitored, prices were controlled, innovation was limited. While this brought order, it also created rigidity, a system that could not bend when hardship struck. This brittleness would become tragically clear after Ashoka's death. Though he ruled with remarkable vision, promoting Buddhism, nonviolence, and welfare, his policies were expensive. He built thousands of stupas, established schools and clinics, sent envoys abroad, and printed edicts across the empire. But these efforts came at a cost, administrative overreach, and an economy stretched thin. After his death around 232 BCE, his successors struggled to maintain control. The vast bureaucracy, once his strength, became a burden. Provinces broke away, local rulers stopped sending taxes, banditry increased, the roads grew unsafe. By 185 BCE, just 50 years after Ashoka's death, the last Mauryan ruler was overthrown. The empire fractured into smaller kingdoms, each less ambitious, less centralized, and far less stable. The fall of the Mauryan Empire was not just a political event. It was, at its core, an economic collapse rooted in systemic overextension. While Ashoka's vision had elevated moral governance and welfare, it had also stretched the limits of what a state-run economy could sustain. Without Ashoka's charisma and authority, the empire's complex machinery no longer functioned with unity. Provinces that had once depended on clear lines of communication with Pataliputra, the imperial capital, were now left autonomous or rebellious. Tax collectors found it harder to enforce tribute. Bandits and warlords preyed on trade routes that had once been guarded by imperial troops. The once robust trade with the West, including links to Hellenistic kingdoms in the Middle East, slowed. Some ports were seized by local rulers. Others fell into disuse due to a lack of investment in infrastructure. Without revenue from trade taxes, the treasury could no longer fund its vast civil service. This exposed a fundamental weakness in the Mauryan system, its lack of local economic resilience. Most of the empire's wealth had flowed upward, toward the capital and the elite. Little had been done to foster regional economic diversity or encourage self-sustaining rural systems beyond simple agriculture. When the center weakened, the peripheries had nothing to fall back on. In regions like Bengal, southern India, and the northwest frontier, new dynasties emerged, often with very different economic approaches. Some favored decentralized markets. Others depended heavily on tribute from conquered peoples. But none matched the scale or the internal contradictions of the Mauryan model. The people meanwhile paid the price. Farmers, once burdened by imperial taxes, now faced the demands of local warlords or mercenary kings. Artisans lost their patrons. Guilds, once regulated by royal decree, now found themselves without protection or purpose. The sophisticated bureaucracy that had recorded everything from land deeds to metal output simply ceased to function in many areas. Barter became more common. Coins, once minted with imperial seals, were now struck by local rulers or stopped circulating altogether in remote areas. Trust in standardized currency eroded, not because the coins were faulty, but because the system behind them had vanished. The Buddhist monastic economy, once thriving under Ashoka, also suffered. Temples and stupas had relied on state support and land grants. With the imperial court gone, monks became dependent on lay donations. many of which dwindled as peasants struggled to survive. Even religious influence fractured. Ashoka's vision of a united, compassionate Dharma had relied on a strong state to promote and protect it. Without that state, sects splintered, rival schools emerged, and support for Buddhism waned in the centuries to follow, eventually replaced by other movements, including a resurgent Hinduism tied to new local powers. The Mauryan collapse is often overshadowed by the grandeur of Ashoka's rule, but its economic lessons are sharp and enduring. A highly centralized economy can achieve remarkable things: highways, postal systems, public welfare, even moral reform. But if it does not build redundancy, if it fails to empower local structures, and if it suppresses adaptability in favor of control, it risks total collapse when the center falls. The Mauryas left behind no continuing dynasty, no sustained economic tradition, and no strong financial institutions. Their system was effective, but not resilient. Once broken, it was not easily repaired. Later Indian empires, such as the Guptas, would draw different lessons, favoring lighter taxation, regional autonomy, and religious patronage networks that were more diverse. But even they could not match the sheer reach of the Mauryan experiment. In the end, the economic collapse of the Mauryan Empire was a quiet one. There were no massive invasions, no burning capitals, just a slow unraveling. A granary emptied, a road overground, a tax ledger closed and never reopened. The empire did not fall with a roar, but with the silence of abandoned halls. And in that silence, new powers waited to rise, cautious, regional, and forever aware of what happens when the economy becomes too large, too centralized, and too brittle to survive the passing of a single king. As the golden dawn rose over the eastern mountains, a new power stirred, one that would rival Rome in its reach, ambition, and fragility. This was Han China, a vast empire born from the ashes of the short-lived Qin dynasty, and destined to shape East Asia for centuries. With sophisticated infrastructure, a unified bureaucracy, and control over some of the world's most valuable trade, the Han dynasty stood tall for 400 years. But even the Han, with all its brilliance, could not escape the slow erosion of economic instability. At its core, the Han economy was an intricate system of state control, private enterprise, and moral philosophy. Confucian ideals stressed hierarchy and harmony, and this translated into an economic policy that sought to balance the needs of the people with the demands of the state. In theory, the emperor ruled by the mandate of heaven, but in practice, he ruled with taxes, monopolies, and labor quotas. The economic engine of Han China was powered by three major pillars: agriculture, state monopolies, and the Silk Road trade. 1. Agriculture and the tax burden. Most Han citizens were small farmers. They grew millet, wheat, rice, and vegetables on plots granted by the state. In exchange, they paid taxes in grain, cloth, and labor. These taxes supported officials, soldiers, and public works. While manageable during years of good harvests, they became crushing during times of drought, flood, or famine, all of which occurred frequently. A typical farmer could expect to spend several months per year working not for his family, but for the state. He would repair roads, dig canals, or serve as a conscript laborer. If he failed to meet his quotas, his land might be seized, or worse, his family could be sold into slavery or pressed into forced relocation. What made this more difficult was the rise of wealthy land-owning families, known as the Great Clans. These elites used their influence to accumulate more land, often by pressuring poor neighbors into selling during hard times. Over time, land ownership became concentrated, shrinking the taxable base. As fewer peasants owned land, the state collected less revenue. Yet the army, the court, and the bureaucracy still demanded payment, so the burden on the remaining smallholders increased, pushing more of them into poverty or rebellion. It was a vicious cycle: high taxes, peasant hardship, land lost, lower revenue, higher taxes. 2. The salt and iron monopolies. To stabilize the treasury, The Han state developed powerful government monopolies, particularly over salt, iron, and alcohol. These were essential goods, and by controlling their production and distribution, the state hoped to extract reliable income without raising peasant taxes. Initially, these monopolies worked. The state minted coins, oversaw quality, and ensured that basic goods remained affordable. But over time, the monopolies became bloated, corrupt, and inefficient. State-run workshops produced inferior products, officials siphoned off profits, smuggling increased, as private producers sold cheaper and better quality goods on the black market. Worse still, the monopolies punished innovation. Artisans and merchants who tried to improve techniques or expand production were often shut down or co-opted by the state. Talent withered under bureaucracy. The court debated these policies fiercely. The famous Discourses on Salt and Iron in 81 BCE saw scholars clash over whether the state should even be in business. Reformers argued that monopolies harmed the people. Defenders insisted they were necessary for survival. In the end, economics lost to politics. The monopolies remained, not because they worked, but because the state had no better option. 3. The Silk Road and the costs of prestige. By the 1st century BCE, Han China had opened trade routes westward. These became the Silk Roads, a web of land and sea corridors linking China to Central Asia, Persia, India, and even Rome. Silk was the crown jewel, prized in every court it touched. Chinese merchants traded silk for horses, spices, glass, and precious metals. Foreign embassies brought tribute. The emperor's court grew ever more opulent, but the Silk Road also carried a hidden price: imbalance. China exported far more than it imported in goods, but in precious metals, the drain was reversed. Gold and silver flowed out of the empire in staggering quantities, exchanged for luxury items and foreign curiosities that benefited only the elite class. As the nobility grew rich, they demanded more from the land: more labor, more taxes, more silk. This further strained the rural population, which saw little of the wealth passing through its borders. And trade, while enriching, was fragile. Nomadic incursions, political instability in Central Asia, or a single broken route could halt commerce for years. When that happened, merchants went bankrupt, taxes dried up, and inflation surged. By the 1st century CE, cracks had begun to show. Rebellions flared in the countryside, corruption rotted the bureaucracy, and even the mighty emperor struggled to pay his officials. Let me know when you're ready for M5P2, where we explore the downfall of Han China's economy and the rise of feudal warlords. As the 1st century gave way to the 2nd, the grandeur of Han China began to flicker. The bureaucracy still functioned, coins still bore the emperor's seal, and imperial edicts continued to flow from the capital at Luoyang. But underneath this polished surface, the economic foundations of the Han were eroding. One of the key indicators of this collapse was the increased privatization of land and power. While the state had once directly managed taxation and labor, it now found itself too weak to enforce laws in distant provinces. Local elites, the great clans, began to usurp state functions. They collected taxes for themselves, hired private guards, and in some cases maintained personal armies. This was the beginning of what would later become China's warlord era. These families had grown wealthy not only through land, but through imperial connections. Many sent their sons to study Confucian classics, take civil service exams, and enter the bureaucracy. From within the system, they bent laws to favor their estates. They exempted their retainers from conscription and taxes, leaving the burden to fall on the ever-dwindling number of free peasants. As the tax base shrank, the central government attempted to extract more from less. New forms of taxation were introduced, and conscription age was lowered. Many farmers, unable to keep up, abandoned their fields or sold themselves into bonded servitude. Some fled to remote areas, joining bandit groups or religious sects that promised protection and justice. The most famous of these movements was the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE, a mass uprising led by Taoist-inspired peasants who claimed the Han had lost the mandate of heaven. Though eventually crushed, the rebellion revealed how deep the economic despair had become. It wasn't just about taxes or land, it was about legitimacy. The people no longer believed the state could protect them, feed them, or govern them fairly. Meanwhile, coinage, once a symbol of imperial control, had become debased and mistrusted. The government, desperate for revenue, minted enormous quantities of coins with lower and lower metal content. Merchants began to refuse official currency, demanding barter or foreign silver instead. In some regions, private mints appeared, run by local lords or even criminal gangs. Trade slowed, prices rose, confidence withered. The empire responded with familiar tactics: new taxes, price controls, forced labor, and crackdowns. But these only worsened the decline. With so much wealth and labor diverted to elite households, the state could no longer fund roads, dams, or military posts. In border areas, nomadic incursions intensified. The Xiongnu and other tribes sensed weakness. Garrisons went unpaid, supplies ran short, and many soldiers deserted. The frontier collapsed, not from invasion alone, but from economic starvation. By the end of the 2nd century CE, the Han dynasty had split into competing factions. The imperial court became a puppet of military generals and eunuch advisors, each more concerned with power than policy. And yet, the economy still mattered. When Cao Cao, one of the era's most formidable warlords, seized control of northern China, he immediately implemented agricultural reforms. He understood that control of land, labor, and food was the key to survival and legitimacy. He introduced the Tuntian system, granting land to soldiers and refugees in exchange for a share of the harvest. While limited in scope, it restored some balance in devastated areas and showed that economic pragmatism could restore order where imperial policy had failed. But by then, the Han dynasty was beyond saving. In 220 CE, after centuries of slow collapse, Emperor Jian abdicated the throne, and China formally entered the Three Kingdoms period, a time of war, division, and fragmentation. The economic collapse of Han China left deep scars. Farmland had been abandoned, infrastructure had crumbled, currency had lost all meaning. More importantly, the belief in a unified, benevolent central government had vanished. The Confucian ideal that a just emperor could ensure harmony through ritual and moral example lay in ruins, buried under decades of mismanagement and greed. And yet, from these ruins, new systems would rise. Future dynasties would learn from the Han's mistakes and its successes. They would restore state monopolies carefully, tax the land more equitably, and rebuild the Silk Roads with renewed vigor. But the memory remained that even the grandest empire, with the wisest scholars and most intricate laws, can fall when its economy becomes a machine that extracts but no longer serves. In the rustle of abandoned coins, in the silence of empty fields, in the ashes of once great cities, Han China teaches us that prosperity without balance is a palace built on sand. As the ancient empires fell silent, Europe entered a new age, not of glittering capitals or flowing coin, but of fortified keeps, dusty manors, and whispered promises bound by land and loyalty. The medieval period, often called the Dark Ages, was less a void than a slow recalibration. A world no longer ruled by emperors and bureaucracies, but by lords, bishops, and barter. This shift was not accidental, it was the economic aftermath of Rome's collapse. Without centralized governance, the Roman road networks deteriorated. Urban markets shrank, trade routes broke apart, and coinage, once reliable and abundant, became rare and localized. In many parts of Europe, money became irrelevant, and with it, the concept of state-managed taxation dissolved. In its place rose something far older and more primal, land-based wealth. A man was rich not by the coin he carried, but by the number of serfs who plowed his fields and the yield of his grain stores. And so, in place of empires, Europe gave birth to feudal kingdoms, economic systems not based on trade, but on obligation. land as currency. In a feudal economy, wealth was measured by land ownership, and land was distributed not through purchase, but through service. A king or duke would grant parcels of land, called fiefs, to nobles in exchange for military support or political allegiance. Those nobles would in turn grant smaller plots to vassals or knights who owed them military service. At the bottom of this pyramid were peasants, and among them serfs, who were bound to the land and obligated to farm it for their lords. This created a system of nested obligations where everyone owed someone else, but few could move freely or independently. While the aristocracy often spoke in terms of honor and loyalty, these were at heart economic arrangements. A noble's promise to bring 20 armed men to battle wasn't just chivalry, it was payment, and the land he received was the return. But unlike the ancient Roman economy, which could be scaled, taxed, and monetized, the feudal system was hyper-local. Each manor or castle functioned like a tiny economic world unto itself. There were no banks, no standardized taxes, and often no real markets beyond the annual fair. What wealth existed was hoarded in granaries, livestock pens, and iron-bound chests buried beneath stone floors. Peasant life and the struggle for subsistence. For the peasant majority, life under feudalism was an endless battle with scarcity. They worked 3 fields in rotation, planting one, leaving another fallow, and using the third for nitrogen-fixing crops. Tools were crude, harvests unpredictable, and winters long. Most of their crop was not theirs to keep. A peasant might owe a portion of his harvest to the Lord, a separate tithe to the church. Labor days, known as corvée, working the Lord's land without pay. Special fees for marriages, deaths, or using the Lord's mill or oven. It was not unusual for a family to lose half or more of what it produced before even feeding itself. And when harvests failed, as they often did, there were no safety nets. Famine was frequent. The Great Famine of 1st Re 151317, for instance, killed millions across northern Europe and revealed how fragile the medieval economy truly was. The church as an economic power. One of the largest economic institutions of the Middle Ages was not a kingdom or noble house, but the Catholic Church. The church owned vast tracts of land, controlled numerous towns, and collected a 10% tithe on agricultural produce. Monasteries produced wine, honey, cheese, and manuscripts, sometimes becoming centers of local economic life. Wealthy nobles often donated land or gold to monasteries to buy spiritual favor, increasing the church's economic power. Yet this power was unevenly distributed. While abbeys in France or Italy might be rich, many parish churches were poor, struggling to maintain even a roof. This imbalance mirrored the broader inequality of the era. The church's ban on usury, charging interest on loans, also limited the development of banking, at least among Christians. Jewish communities, often barred from land ownership, filled this void by becoming moneylenders, a role that made them essential to the economy, but also targets of persecution during times of economic stress. Towns trade in the flicker of revival. By the 11th century, a quiet transformation began. Some towns, particularly in Italy and Flanders, began to thrive. Long-distance trade re-emerged, with Venetian merchants sailing to Byzantium and Alexandria, and Flemish weavers producing textiles for export. Markets expanded, coinage returned, and guilds of craftsmen organized to protect their trades and wages. But these towns were exceptions, not the rule. In the countryside, which still housed 90% of the population, life remained rooted in obligation and subsistence. Lords grew rich, not by innovation, but by inheritance and extraction. The medieval kingdom was a world of economic stagnation, periodically interrupted by war, plague, or holy crusade. And yet, even this slow-moving system would eventually fracture, not through revolution, but through the unexpected consequences of catastrophe. Let me know when you're ready for M6P2, where we explore how plague, war, and growing trade pressures began to unravel feudal Europe's fragile economy. By the 14th century, the medieval economic order had reached a delicate tipping point. For generations, Europe's feudal system had rested on predictable rhythms of planting and harvesting, of lords extracting rents and peasants delivering their dues. But the 1300s would bring not just a crack in this foundation, but a violent shattering. It began with an event that no ruler, priest, or merchant could control: the Black Death. When the plague struck in 1347, it swept across Europe with stunning speed and devastation. By the time it receded, it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. Entire villages vanished, fields lay unplowed, churches stood empty. The very structure of feudal society, based on land, labor, and fixed roles, was thrown into chaos. From an economic standpoint, the Black Death triggered an immediate and fundamental shift. Labor became scarce. Where once lords had their pick of peasants to work the land, now they faced shortages. Survivors, aware of their newfound value, began to demand higher wages, better terms, and even mobility. Some fled to towns where wages were better. Others refused traditional obligations, threatening revolt. The response from landowners and monarchs was often reactionary. Laws, such as England's Statute of Labourers, 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict worker movement. But enforcement was difficult. The genie was out of the bottle. In the countryside, lords struggled to maintain their estates. The manorial system, which had dominated for centuries, began to erode. Many landlords were forced to commute labor dues into rent, effectively creating tenant farmers who paid money instead of working the land. This marked a slow but decisive shift toward a cash-based rural economy. Meanwhile, in urban centers, a different transformation was underway. Survivors of the plague inherited property, tools, and shops. As a result, per capita wealth rose, and demand for goods increased. This spurred an expansion of crafts, markets, and trade. Cities such as Florence, Bruges, and Ghent grew wealthy from textiles, banking, and merchant ventures. New economic institutions began to emerge. Banks like the Medici in Florence or the Fugger family in Augsburg offered credit, financed monarchies, and facilitated international trade. Double-entry bookkeeping, invented in Italy, revolutionized accounting and trust in transactions. Guilds, once protective of quality and training, became more politicized and restrictive. They tried to limit competition, but increasingly faced pressure from rising entrepreneurs who operated outside guild control. As towns gained economic power, they sought greater political autonomy. Many negotiated charters, paid off kings, or simply took control. The feudal balance began to tip. Wealth once rooted in land was now shifting toward commerce. This transformation also challenged the church. The immense wealth of monastic orders and the clerical hierarchy, often untouched by taxes, drew criticism. Simultaneously, new ideas emerged about interest, capital, and profit. While usury remained technically forbidden, loopholes were exploited. Merchants and bankers argued that risk justified gain, planting the seeds of early capitalism. Jewish communities, long limited to roles such as money lending, continued to play a crucial role in medieval finance. But during times of economic hardship or debt crises, they were often scapegoated. Pogroms swept through cities. In England, 1290, France, 1392, Jewish populations were expelled, sometimes after their debts were canceled by grateful rulers. The final economic blow came from warfare. The 100 Years' War, First Rite 3714553, between England and France drained treasuries and devastated countryside. Armies requisitioned grain, burned villages, and disrupted trade. To fund war, monarchs raised taxes, debased coinage, and borrowed heavily, often from Italian or Flemish bankers. When they defaulted, entire financial networks collapsed. In 1345, the Bardi and Peruzzi banks of Florence failed after King Edward II of England defaulted on massive loans. Their collapse triggered a financial panic that reverberated across Europe. These events showed how interconnected medieval economies were becoming and how dependent monarchies had grown on private credit. No longer could kings simply rely on feudal dues. They needed cash, and lots of it. By the late 15th century, the feudal world of manors and tithes had given way to something new and uncertain. Serfdom declined, and in many places vanished altogether. Coinage returned to circulation, and with it, a rebirth of markets. Urban centers grew, becoming hubs of power and innovation, and monarchies, no longer just landowners, evolved into tax-levying states. The foundations of capitalism, wages, credit, private enterprise, had begun to form not as grand theory, but as survival mechanisms. The medieval economy didn't end in fire. It rotted, cracked, and transformed, shaped by pestilence, rebellion, and trade. As Europe struggled to recover from plague and fragmentation, another world thrived just beyond its southern and eastern frontiers, a world of glittering cities, flowing trade routes, and scholarship that illuminated the globe. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, the Islamic Golden Age brought together cultures, markets, and minds from Spain to Central Asia under the economic and intellectual umbrella of the caliphates. At the heart of this era stood the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, a city so rich it was said its night sky shimmered with lanterns and its markets never slept. But this prosperity was not purely the result of faith or conquest. It was built upon a carefully constructed economic system, a sophisticated network of commerce, finance, agriculture, and administration, a web of trade like no other. The Abbasids inherited and expanded one of the most extensive trade networks the world had yet seen. Goods moved along overland routes, such as the Silk Roads, as well as through maritime paths across the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf. From China came silk and porcelain. From India, spices and textiles. From Africa, gold, ivory, and slaves. From Europe, furs, timber, and even captured knowledge. In return, the Islamic world exported glassware, steel, paper, textiles, and, increasingly, luxury items produced in its own booming cities. Markets in Basra, Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba became legendary for their variety and richness. Trade was facilitated not only by geography, but by policy. The caliphs built roads and rest stations, standardized weights and measures, and enforced contracts. At a time when European merchants feared travel beyond their borders, Muslim traders sailed from Spain to Indonesia with legal and logistical support. Finance, the invention of trust. To manage this flow of wealth, Islamic finance developed remarkably advanced tools. Chief among these were the suftaja and hawala, early forms of checks and money transfer systems. A merchant in Cairo could deposit funds and withdraw them in Samarkand, without carrying a single gold coin across the desert. Islamic law prohibited riba, oshri, but this restriction led to innovation rather than stagnation. Partnerships, mudarabah, and joint ventures, musharaka, allowed profits to be shared and risk to be distributed. Instead of interest-bearing loans, investors funded expeditions or businesses and received a share of the revenue. Banks, or rather, powerful merchant houses, emerged to manage accounts, credit, and letters of exchange. Trust was the key. A reputation for honesty and reliability often mattered more than collateral. These systems enabled the rise of a wealthy merchant class, who in turn funded mosques, schools, and libraries, ensuring that prosperity was not hoarded but circulated through society. Agriculture and the Green Revolution. Beyond the cities, economic strength was anchored in a thriving agricultural base. Between the 8th and 12th centuries, Islamic lands underwent what historians now call the Islamic Agricultural Revolution. New crops, such as sugarcane, cotton, rice, citrus fruits, bananas, and eggplant, were introduced from India, Persia, and beyond. Sophisticated irrigation systems, including qanats, canals, and water wheels, transformed arid regions into productive farmland. Scientific treatises on soil science, crop rotation, and fertilization were widely disseminated. Farmers had access to Arabic language manuals that explained best practices, pest control, and yield improvement, centuries before such ideas took hold in Europe. The Caliphate imposed taxes on land and produce, but also invested in agricultural development, knowing that a strong countryside supported a wealthy city. Grain flowed into Baghdad's markets, cotton filled the looms of Cairo, olives, dates, and saffron were shipped across the Mediterranean. Knowledge as an economic engine. Unlike many empires that hoarded knowledge behind palace walls, the Islamic Golden Age treated learning as an economic asset. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, funded by caliphs and enriched by merchants, became the world's most celebrated center of translation and research. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic, on subjects from mathematics and medicine to astronomy and mechanics. These books weren't just for philosophers, they were used by engineers to build aqueducts, physicians to establish hospitals, and bureaucrats to manage taxes and trade. Paper, introduced from China, made books cheaper and more widespread. Book markets in Baghdad and Cordova attracted scholars and merchants alike as knowledge became a commodity with real value. Education wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. A literate bureaucracy, trained in math and law, made commerce smoother and administration more efficient. Waqf endowments, charitable trusts, funded schools, infrastructure, and even public baths. But beneath the glory, cracks appear. Despite its brilliance, this system was not without weaknesses. The state's wealth relied heavily on urban trade and agricultural output. When political fragmentation began in the 10th century, it disrupted both. Provincial governors stopped sending taxes to Baghdad, roads went unrepaired, rival dynasties fought for control of trade routes. The merchant economy, though adaptive, still depended on a stable political and legal environment. As caliphs became figureheads and local emirs grew powerful, corruption and double taxation emerged. The once efficient system of checks, credit, and free movement faltered under uncertainty. And while the economy supported scholarship, it also became a source of competition. Wealthy cities resented imperial taxes. Merchant guilds clashed with landowners. Religious endowments tied up land and capital that could not be taxed, limiting state revenue in times of need. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the brilliance of the Islamic Golden Age remained, but its economic foundation was beginning to tremble. The complex balance of merchants, scholars, farmers, and bureaucrats that had sustained the empire was now threatened by both internal disunity and external aggression. At the heart of this unraveling was a loss of central control. The Abbasid Caliphate, which once stretched from North Africa to the Indus River, had become a patchwork of semi-autonomous provinces. In many regions, powerful warlords, governors, or foreign dynasties like the Buyids, Seljuks, and Fatimids took over local administration. These rulers still paid lip service to the caliph in Baghdad, but in reality they controlled taxation, trade, and justice. This decentralization had deep economic consequences. Without consistent oversight, trade routes became insecure. Banditry rose. Caravans that once moved freely now had to negotiate multiple tolls or protection payments. In cities, competing factions demanded bribes or imposed taxes arbitrarily, creating uncertainty and stifling investment. The invasions that shook the earth. Then came the invasions. First, the Crusades. From the late 11th century onward, European armies launched a series of brutal campaigns to capture Jerusalem and the Levant. Though often unsuccessful in the long term, the Crusaders devastated key commercial regions like Syria and Palestine, disrupting trade and diverting resources from urban development to military defense. The real blow, however, came from the east. In the early 13th century, the Mongols swept across Central Asia with unprecedented ferocity. Their armies decimated cities, destroyed irrigation systems, and obliterated entire economies. In 1258, Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, fell to Hulagu Khan. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from drowned books, and red with the blood of slain scholars and citizens. Baghdad's libraries burned, its markets were looted, its canals, the veins of its agricultural system, were damaged or destroyed, never to be fully repaired. The destruction was not merely symbolic, it represented the sudden severing of economic lifelines that had taken centuries to build. The city never recovered its former status, and with its fall, the intellectual and commercial heart of the Islamic Golden Age was extinguished. Shifting trade routes and lost advantage. Even in regions spared from Mongol swords, economic gravity began to shift. The Silk Road, once dominated by Muslim merchants, came under Mongol control and later fragmented further as new maritime routes emerged. European sailors, especially the Portuguese and Spanish, began to explore sea routes to India, bypassing traditional overland corridors. By the 15th century, these sea routes were rapidly becoming more efficient, safer, and more profitable than land caravans. The Islamic world, once the crossroads of Afro-Eurasian trade, now found itself circumvented. Cities like Basra, Damascus, and Aleppo declined in importance. Coastal towns without deep-water ports struggled to adapt. The revenue once generated from caravan taxes, market levies, and merchant tolls dwindled. Meanwhile, European economies, fueled by colonial gold and silver and protected by chartered trading companies, began to rise. And as the balance shifted, former centers of Islamic commerce and scholarship increasingly became dependent on foreign trade, not dominant in it. Internal fractures and wealth stagnation. Within the Islamic empires, the role of land and inheritance began to erode fiscal stability. The Waqf system, charitable endowments that funded mosques, schools, hospitals, and public works, had once been a proud pillar of civic life. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, many waqfs had become vehicles for wealth preservation rather than public service. Land placed in waqf could not be taxed, sold, or confiscated. This allowed wealthy families and officials to protect their assets from state demands. While the intention was pious, the result was a shrinking tax base and a state increasingly unable to fund infrastructure, defense, or bureaucracy. Corruption flourished, officials skimmed revenue, tax collectors outsourced their jobs to middlemen who squeezed the population for profit. Agricultural productivity declined as irrigation systems aged and state support vanished. Even in major cities like Cairo or Cordoba, economic life became increasingly hollowed out. The schools remained, the scholars taught, but fewer merchants passed through their gates, fewer wares filled their markets, fewer ships docked in their harbors. Cultural resilience, economic decline. It is important to note, the decline of economic power did not mean the end of Islamic civilization. Cultural, scientific, and religious traditions endured, often migrating eastward to Persia, Central Asia, and India. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires each inherited aspects of the Abbasid legacy. They built roads, revived cities, and issued coins. Yet even these later empires, for all their power, operated in a world where the Islamic world was no longer the uncontested commercial heart of the globe. They struggled with the same issues: land hoarding, tax evasion, foreign dependency, and the slow creep of inequality. And all of them in different ways would eventually be overshadowed by the rising tide of European maritime empires, industrial economies, and colonial extraction. The Islamic Golden Age did not fall in one night. It faded across centuries, its markets emptied by changing winds, its scholars displaced by conquest, its vaults hollowed by inefficiency and loss. What was once a marvel of trade and knowledge became a memory, etched in crumbling stone, recorded in silent manuscripts, and whispered in the stories of travelers who remembered a time when the world turned through Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba. Every empire ends, not always in fire and battle, but in silence, disorder, and economic unraveling. While politics, conquest, and ideology have played their parts in shaping civilizations, it is economics that most often determines whether they endure or fall. And across centuries, from Babylon to Byzantium From the Mauryas to the Abbasids, we see a shared pattern emerge. When economies crumble, so do kings. This final module draws the scattered threads of our story together. For while each civilization collapsed in its own time and place, the signs were often eerily similar. From the flooding Tigris to the frozen fields of Europe, from forgotten trade roads in the Gobi to burned ledgers in Baghdad, the echoes of economic failure resound through history like a warning. The first signals of collapse. Almost universally, collapse begins not with catastrophe, but with imbalance. When the structures that support production, exchange, and governance lose their equilibrium. In Mesopotamia, farmers could no longer manage salinized soil, yet tax expectations remained unchanged. In Rome, inflation ballooned while wages stagnated and coinage degraded. In Han China, land became concentrated in elite hands as peasants fled and stopped paying taxes. In the caliphates, regional lords siphoned revenue, and long trade routes became fragmented. The state, whether ruled by emperors, caliphs, or councils, responds with predictable desperation. Raise taxes, debase currency, confiscate land, or impose controls. These measures, rather than correcting the problem, often accelerate the decline. Why? Because they erode trust. Trust in the state, trust in the currency, trust in the future. And without trust, an economy becomes brittle. When cities go silent, cities are the lifeblood of empire. They are nodes of trade, administration, and production. But cities thrive only when the countryside supports them, and when roads, markets, and money move freely. Time and again, collapse is marked by urban retreat. Babylon, once towering with ziggurats and scribes, becomes a backwater when Persian and later Greek rulers shift economic focus elsewhere. So, what is much impressed by Dowd at this moment? Was there anything else fiscally backward? Luoyang and Chang'an, capitals of Han China, suffer repeated sackings and abandonment as internal wars sever the supply chains that once fed them. Rum by the 5th century shrinks to a shell of its former self, with grain shipments cut off and aqueducts falling into disrepair. Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasids, is reduced to ashes by the Mongols, its libraries gone, and its canals choked with silt. The decline of cities reflects a breakdown in infrastructure and complexity. Sophisticated economies rely on systems, taxation, water management, postal service, roads, merchant networks. When these fall apart, the people follow. And the silence that replaces the clamor of market squares is profound. Barter bandits in the black market. When formal economies break down, informal ones take their place. In collapsing Rome, soldiers were paid in food and land instead of coins. Medieval Europe after plague, peasants fled manors to become bandits or free laborers. In the late Abbasid era, smuggling networks became more efficient than state-controlled trade. Barter resurfaces, not as a nostalgic return to simplicity, but as an act of desperation. A farmer trades grain for shoes. A soldier exchanges swords for salt. A merchant hoards silver because no one trusts the coin stamped by a dying king. The economy doesn't disappear, it retreats, hardens, and fractures into microsystems of survival. But without coordination or scale, growth ends. Innovation slows, poverty rises. Collapse is uneven and unkind. It is tempting to think of empire-wide collapse as a single moment, a battle lost, a capital burned, a king slain. But economic collapse is rarely so neat. Rather, it unfolds unevenly. In some provinces, local rulers thrive while the center falters. Merchants in coastal cities pivot to new routes as inland trade dies. Religious institutions grow stronger as people seek refuge and food from the church, the mosque, or the temple. But for the average person, the farmer, weaver, porter, or clerk, collapse means uncertainty, hunger, and fear. Livelihoods vanish. Prices fluctuate wildly, savings evaporate. Food may be grown but cannot be distributed. Goods may exist but cannot be bought. Armies are raised not for defense but for looting and tribute. And as economic desperation rises, so does violence. Revolts, repressions, mass migrations. Empires implode not just in policy, but in the lives of millions who simply stop believing in tomorrow. In the quiet aftermath of collapse, history doesn't end. It mutates. The fall of an empire is not only the closing of a chapter, it is the beginning of a new, often chaotic, era defined by redistribution, reinvention, and resurgence. Though each collapse brought suffering, it also forced societies to confront the failures that led them there. And in the rubble, something new always took root. The end of Rome, the birth of Europe. When Rome fell in the West, it left behind a vacuum of authority and economic cohesion. Its roads cracked, its aqueducts crumbled, and its cities dwindled. But its memory endured, in Latin, in law, in the dreams of kings who styled themselves emperors. In the economic vacuum, feudalism arose. It was a deeply flawed system, born not of vision but of necessity. Yet within it, local economies stabilized. Castles became centers of power, monasteries preserved learning, and towns slowly grew along rivers and roads. From collapse came adaptation. Europe's eventual commercial revolution, centuries later, was rooted in the ashes of the Roman market economy. The Renaissance did not emerge from nowhere, but from a long gestation amid scarcity and reinvention. Long China's legacy. The fall of the Han Dynasty ushered in a chaotic era of warlords and fractured rule known as the Three Kingdoms period. Millions died, cities fell into ruin, and trade routes disappeared. Yet out of this devastation came a new political philosophy. The harsh lessons of Han collapse taught future dynasties to better balance land reforms, taxation, and centralized administration. When the Tang Dynasty rose centuries later, it did so with the memory of Han fragility etched deep into its reforms. The imperial examination system, land redistribution, and infrastructure investments were not mere innovations. They were corrections to the economic missteps that had brought down the Han, the Abbasid twilight, and Islamic shifts. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 symbolized the end of the Abbasid era's grandeur. But even as its intellectual and commercial heart was gutted, Islamic civilization did not vanish. Instead, it dispersed. Centers of power and trade shifted east and west. Cairo, Samarkand, and later Istanbul emerged as new cultural and economic hubs. The Ottoman Empire, while inheriting the mantle of the Abbasids, implemented tighter fiscal controls, reorganized land tenure, and adapted to changing trade realities. In India, the Mughals would build a vast empire rooted in economic sophistication, learned from both Persian and Central Asian traditions. And in West Africa, Islamic merchant networks spread gold, salt, and culture from Timbuktu to the Nile. Collapse was not a death, it was a diffusion. Ideas, systems, and practices traveled, even as capitals burned. Shared economic lessons across time. Across all these collapses, Roman, Han, Abbasid, and more, we see a recurring set of lessons. Centralization breeds efficiency, but also vulnerability. When one capital controls too much, its fall can sever an entire empire's arteries. Agricultural sustainability is non-negotiable. Every empire that exhausted its soil, overtaxed its farmers, or ignored rural hardship paid a heavy price. Trade routes are lifelines. When caravans no longer arrive, when merchants no longer trust the roads, cities wither. Inequality poisons stability. When wealth pools into a small elite and tax burdens fall on the poor, rebellion simmers beneath every harvest. Flexibility determines survival. Empires that adapted, like the Byzantines for a time, outlasted those that clung rigidly to failing systems. Echoes in the modern world? Though we live in a vastly different global economy, one driven by technology, digital infrastructure, and international law, the core principles remain. Nations still rely on trust in their currency, in their institutions, in their ability to deliver stability. And when that trust erodes, through inflation, corruption, mismanagement, or social inequality, the ghosts of past empires begin to whisper. Not all collapses will be sudden. Some may stretch across decades, hidden in statistics and quiet streets. But the patterns, as history shows, are rarely new. We've seen them before, in Rome's overexpansion and fiscal panic, in Han China's tax evasion and elite hoarding, in the Caliphate's fragmentation and lost trade, in Europe's dependence on land and the chaos wrought by plague. Final reflections. So what can we learn? Perhaps this, that economic collapse is rarely just about money. It's about people, how they eat, how they work, how they believe in the future. When those bonds flay, no emperor, no general, no tax decree can hold the structure together. And yet, collapse is not just an ending. It is the soil for new beginnings. The ruins of temples become the stones of churches. The parchment of fallen scholars seeds new libraries. The lost roads are rediscovered, repaved, and rewalked. History mourns the fall of its empires, but it never stops building. Across the stretch of human history, from stone cities on the Euphrates to marble forums in Rome and glimmering minarets of Baghdad, empires have soared and fallen. What remains long after their banners fade and languages die is not just the memory of glory, but the echoes of their collapse. For beneath every golden dome and throne of power ran the veins of an economy. Taxed fields, minted coins, trade caravans, and laboring hands. And when those veins dried, so did the empire. Now, in this final chapter, we step back to examine what all these collapses tell us, not just about the past, but about power itself. Because no matter how distant these events may seem, their patterns repeat with uncanny precision. The illusion of invincibility. One of the most consistent features of great empires is the belief that they cannot fall. Their walls are high, their treasuries full, their names spoken with reverence. And yet, the collapse always begins when the surface appears stable. Babylon's scribes still wrote contracts, even as soil turned to salt. Rome's coins still bore emperors' profiles, as legions abandoned the frontiers. And China still printed official edicts as peasants deserted fields for warlords. The Abbasids still issued philosophical treatises as trade routes crumbled. Byzantium still recited imperial rituals even as merchants paid taxes to Venice instead. Empires don't often fall when they are weak. They fall when they are too rigid to adapt. When bureaucracy becomes self-serving. When elites hoard land and influence. When military spending outpaces the economy's ability to sustain it. When the state consumes more than it returns. And most critically, when the people no longer believe. The human cost of collapse. We often speak of economic collapse in terms of numbers, debt ratios, currency devaluation, tax burdens, but at its core, collapse is always a human tragedy. Imagine a Roman blacksmith whose tools no longer fetch silver because inflation has made money meaningless. A Mesopotamian farmer who can't plant barley because salt ruins the fields, but the tax collector comes anyway. A Byzantine shopkeeper who watches Italian merchants sell silk tax-free while his own stall sits empty. A peasant in Marian, India, forced to abandon his farm as forest retakes the land once cleared by Ashoka's engineers. Collapse means fear, of hunger, of lawlessness, of the future. It means selling a child to pay a debt. It means hiding coins under floorboards. It means watching temples grow while granaries stand empty. And it never happens overnight. It arrives slowly, like rot behind painted walls. Collapse doesn't mean the end. Yet for all the sorrow, collapse is not annihilation. From Rome's ashes rose the cultures of medieval Europe. Han China's legacy shaped Tang administration and Confucian thought for centuries. The Abbasid spirit lived on in Persian libraries and Mughal courts. Even the ruins of Byzantium provided the foundation stones for Ottoman Istanbul. Collapse is transformation, painful, unpredictable, but not final. Sometimes it clears the ground for something better. a chance for new ideas, fairer systems, or more localized resilience. But that potential is rarely seized by those in power. Why? Because the ruling class of a collapsing empire often fights not to save the people, but to preserve their privileges. They double down. They silence dissent. They tighten control. They drain the treasury to pay mercenaries, not to fix aqueducts. And by the time reform is recognized as necessary, it's too late. Patterns that echo into the present. We do not live in ancient Rome. We do not trade in Mesopotamian shekels or ride Hunair postal roads. But the mechanics of collapse, they remain hauntingly familiar. When wealth becomes concentrated in few hands, when productive land is overtaxed or exhausted, when public trust erodes and corruption becomes normalized, when wars are fought with borrowed money, when cities depend on imports they no longer control, when infrastructure is ignored because short-term profit wins elections, then collapse is not a question of if, but when. History whispers always, avoid my mistakes, learn from my ruins, or repeat them. If the collapses of ancient empires reveal anything, it is this: no power is eternal, but no collapse is meaningless. These endings were not mere footnotes and dusty scrolls, they were hard resets, painful, humbling, transformative. And in those transformations lie our final reflections, because while ruins may crumble into soil, the lessons they offer stand upright, waiting to be noticed. Economic collapse is preventable. One of the most striking patterns we've seen is how predictable collapse becomes in hindsight. The warning signs, shrinking revenue, rising inequality, corruption, failing infrastructure, labor shortages, and eroding trust, appear decades before the final fall. Rulers are given ample opportunities to act, and some try. Reforms are drafted, taxes are adjusted, debts are restructured, but more often than not, those reforms are too little, too late, or violently resisted by those who benefit most from the current system. Han emperors tried land reform, but the great estates returned. Roman administrators revised taxes, but inflation raged. Abbasid caliphs debated trade policy, but could not protect the roads. Byzantine emperors punished corrupt tax collectors, only to replace them with others just as greedy. The truth is uncomfortable. Collapse is preventable, but rarely prevented, because it requires sacrifice from the powerful, not the poor. Resilience is built from the bottom. Empires rise from vision, but they survive by listening to the ground beneath them, to the farmers, artisans, soldiers, and scribes who actually sustain them. When these voices are ignored, when systems grow too top-heavy, collapse becomes more likely. And yet, within the wreckage, these same people often become the seed of recovery. After Rome fell, it was not emperors who revived Europe, but monastic scribes, village councils, and merchant guilds. After the Hun, it was regional farmers and local leaders who kept society functioning during chaos. After Abbasid fragmentation, scholars and traders carried Islamic culture forward on foot and sail. After the Black Death, surviving peasants demanded wages and mobility, transforming Europe's social fabric forever. Empires may collapse from the top, but rebuilding always begins from the bottom. The power of adaptation. If there is one trait that delayed collapse, or at times even prevented it, it was adaptability. Empires that responded to crisis with flexibility tended to outlast those that resisted change. The Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire restructured its military into themes to survive after early defeats. China's Tang and Song dynasties reimagined land tenure and tax policies after Han collapse. Islamic empires shifted trade routes and urban centers in response to Mongol devastation. Even when full recovery wasn't possible, adaptability bought time. It gave generations a chance to survive, evolve, and plan for something new. Stagnation, by contrast, ensured death. Lessons for today. We do not face the same threats as ancient empires. No barbarian hordes wait at city gates. No plague or drought alone will bring down a global civilization. But we face our own forms of systemic strain, climate change and resource depletion, wealth inequality on a global scale, fragile supply chains and economic overdependence, debt crises and currency devaluation, declining trust in institutions. And in many ways, our societies are more interconnected and more complex than any empire before. This makes them both more resilient and more fragile. Resilient because knowledge, communication, and cooperation can move faster than ever. Fragile because shocks, when they occur, can ripple globally in days. The greatest risk is not invasion or rebellion, it is complacency. The belief that collapse can't happen here. But the dust of Nineveh, the silence of Babylon, the cracked stones of Carthage, they all say otherwise. Ending with hope. To study collapse is not to become cynical, it is to become attentive. History is not a prophecy, it is a mirror. And if we dare to look clearly, we will see both our flaws and our strengths. We will remember that, no matter how great the city, it is built by hands. That no matter how vast the treasury, it is filled by labor. That no matter how absolute a ruler may seem, they are nothing without the governed. And most of all, that collapse is not the end of the story. It is a turning of the page. Now, let us step away from the thrones and treasury halls. Away from the accountants and emperors, from budgets etched into clay and tribute weighed on golden scales. Because when empires fall, when their economies unravel, the collapse does not echo first through palaces, it trembles first in the stomach, in the empty grain jar, in the merchant silence, in the child who cannot sleep because hunger outpaces nightfall. This is the story of economic collapse as it was felt, not calculated, not in ledgers, but in lives. We begin in the late Roman Empire around the 3rd century CE, when coins were growing thin and soldiers were growing restless. Emperors minted silver coins with less and less silver, filling the gaps with base metals. On paper, it worked. But in markets, bakers and butchers began refusing imperial currency. One soldier, returning from the northern frontier with months of back pay, found that the coins in his pouch could not buy bread. The vendor held up a denarius and laughed bitterly. "You do better to trade your boots," he said. And so he did. Across the empire, markets shifted to barter. A goat for linen, bread for a day's labor. Tools were no longer bought, they were traded, borrowed, stolen, or handmade. In the countryside, farmers stopped bringing goods to town altogether. The roads were no longer safe, and the coin no longer trusted. This was not recession, this was breakdown. In Egypt, once the empire's granary, grain became scarce, not because the Nile had failed, but because the imperial tax was now demanded not in crops, but in coin. A cruel paradox. The farmer had food, but no coin. The state wanted coin, but could not eat it. The grain was hoarded, hidden in cellars, buried in pits. In Alexandria, bread prices soared and riots broke out near the docks. Families threw stones at ships departing for Rome, crying that the emperor fed strangers while his own children starved. Elsewhere, in the Sasanian Empire, merchants once carried silk and spice along the arteries of the Silk Road. But when imperial debts rose and border skirmishes drained the treasury, protection faltered. Caravans were ambushed, trade halted. Cities that once thrived on commerce grew quiet. Tents disappeared, stalls stood empty, only dust and rumors remained. And with every market lost, so too was a livelihood. Tailors, scribes, potters, goldsmiths, all felt the walls of empire tighten like a noose. A potter in Antioch, who once sold amphorae to wine merchants, found no buyers, no wine shipments, no trade. He repurposed his kiln to fire roof tiles, then bricks. Then, when demand vanished altogether, he left. He walked north, toward a city that no longer existed. Because this, too, is the mark of collapse, migration. Not conquest, not exile, but quiet, desperate departure. Entire villages vanished, not in flame, but in silence. In China, during the final years of the Eastern Han Dynasty, corruption and drought fed into one another. Tax burdens rose, imperial officials enriched themselves while peasants sold their children. A farmer, unable to pay his grain quota, was whipped in public. His neighbors watched in silence. Then at night, they buried their tools and fled into the forest. By morning, the fields were empty. Sometimes, the collapse of an economy sparked not just departure, but resistance. In Rome, slave revolts increased when food grew scarce. Even in decline, the empire demanded luxury from its slaves, tutors, cooks, gladiators, scribes, but offered only scraps. In the provinces, some rebelled, others simply escaped. It was easier to vanish when roads crumbled and towns emptied. In the Mauryan Empire, at its end, the royal treasury shrank. Artisans once supported by royal stipends were dismissed, soldiers unpaid, borders neglected. The result? Not just military weakness, but social fragmentation. Craftsmen turned mercenary, scholars sold scripts to survive, former court dancers entertained at roadside inns. For every kingdom that fell, 1,000 stories faded, not with a sword stroke, but with the hush of poverty. And yet, among the ruins, some adapted. In collapsing Babylon, when coinage failed, scribes began trading their literacy for food. A man might not need a priest, but he always needed someone to record his debt. And so the scribes endured, less respected, but still necessary. In a fallen Roman province, a blacksmith stopped making arms and began making plows. Smaller, simpler, bartered for by the harvest. In time, that blacksmith's descendants would forge again, not for warlords, but for villages. The most remarkable thing about imperial economic collapse is not the speed, though it is often fast, but the quietness. There are no thunderclaps, no closing bells. Just empty shelves, shop windows, a mother drying her last loaf of bread in the sun, a merchant burning his unsold cloth for warmth. These are the ghosts of economy, not figures, but faces. In the next part, we will explore how whole cultures faded in the wake of economic ruin, how traditions vanished, languages died, and memory thinned, leaving only ruins and riddles in their place. When an empire collapses, its coins corrode and its laws vanish. But even more quietly, more tragically, its culture begins to fade, and with it, the voices of those who once lived under its roof, the farmers, the bakers, the scribes, the mothers. They do not leave behind marble statues or chronicles in gold leaf. They leave fragments, tools buried in dust, names half remembered in village songs, traditions whispered by the old to those barely old enough to understand. In the wake of economic collapse, the very rhythms of life changed. In once bustling Roman towns, the baths were the first to close, then the forums, then the schools. Teachers, once paid by wealthy patrons or local officials, were dismissed. Their scrolls sold. Children learned not grammar and rhetoric, but how to barter, how to scavenge. A boy in Gaul who might have recited Cicero a generation earlier now learned which mushrooms were edible, how to mend a sandal, and how to patch a roof with dried dung. Culture shrank, life narrowed. In Mesopotamia, when trade collapsed and royal support withered, temples, once filled with priests, music, and feasts, became silent. Without state funding, ceremonies ceased, statues crumbled. The names of gods, once spoken daily, became taboo or simply forgotten. A tablet from Babylon may list debts in shekels, but it says nothing of the man who carved it, how he coped when the temple fell silent, when no grain came down the river, when buyers vanished like dust in the desert wind. And yet, this slow unraveling did not come evenly. Some towns, positioned by rivers or nestled in fertile valleys, endured. In them, local leaders emerged, forming small, self-sustaining communities. They preserved what they could: a few books, a prayer, a song. They became the vessels of memory. Others were not so fortunate. In the Han Dynasty's dying years, entire counties fell off the map. Families buried their ancestral records to protect them and never returned. Scribes, once keepers of dynastic history, became carpenters or innkeepers. Without royal commissions, there were no more chronicles, no new scrolls. 1,000 years of poetry could disappear in a single hungry winter. There were no libraries to burn. The fire had already burned in the belly. And for the enslaved, those lowest on the ladder of empire, the collapse brought not always freedom, but a change of masters. One empire's ruin became another's rise. In the Caribbean, in Africa, in India, generations later, new empires would repeat the cycle. But in these ancient collapses, those enslaved were rarely remembered at all. Their voices are found only in what was built, tilled, harvested, and in the quiet that followed when they were no longer there. What is most haunting is how hope lingered, even in decline. A farmer might still pray for rain. A merchant might wait at his empty stall, hoping for a caravan that never arrives. A mother might promise her child that things would return to how they were. And sometimes, briefly, they did. A harvest returned, a road reopened, a coin regained value, but the tide never reversed for long. And so the survivors adapted. They wove scraps of old traditions into new beliefs. They told stories of vanished kings and golden ages, even as they planted barley and taught their children not Latin or Sanskrit, but whatever tongue now passed from mouth to mouth. We see this in the quiet transitions. The Roman villas turned into rural estates. The grand Buddhist monasteries in India repurposed as barns or shelters. Babylon's ziggurats swallowed by sand, even as nearby villagers built clay homes with bricks stolen from their sacred walls. What was once empire became landscape. What was once economy became memory. And those who lived through these declines did not call them collapses. They did not speak of the end of civilization. They spoke of drought, taxes, fear, prices, war, emptiness. They grieved not for empires, but for fathers lost to famine, for neighbors who fled and never returned, for children who died before their names were recorded. History often remembers only the moment the last emperor dies, or the city falls, or the treasury runs dry, but collapse is lived in silence. It is lived in repetition. A baker using less flour, a smith melting old tools to forge new ones, a widow selling her husband's robes to buy barley. And yet, even then, there was resilience. Not triumphant, not grand, but stubborn. A farmer planting seed in poor soil, a teacher reciting poetry to children who would never read it, a song passed from grandmother to granddaughter long after the language it was written in had vanished. These are the ghosts of collapsed economies. Not phantoms, but echoes of endurance. They do not cry out in despair, they murmur in survival. And so, when we study the fall of empires, let us remember it was not just silver that was lost, it was stories, those taste and touch and voice. It was people who lived, who loved, who hoped, and who, in the quiet of ruin, carried civilization in their hands, even as it slipped away. In the dim corridors of time, empires rose like great waves, carrying gold, grain, and glory upon their crest. But each in its own way began to break. Not in a single night, not in the clash of armies alone, but in quiet, creeping patterns. Coins wore thin, grain shipments stopped, markets fell silent, and voices that once praised emperors turned to whispers of doubt. When we look back, whether to the Roman Empire, the Marian court, Han China, or the ziggurats of Babylon, we do not see the same story told again and again. But we do see the same shadows stretching across different landscapes. These are the economic warning signs, the deep tremors that shook the foundations of ancient societies long before they crumbled to dust. Let us walk through them, slowly, gently, like an archaeologist brushing away the dirt of centuries. What were the signs? What did they feel like to the people living through them? And why do they seem so familiar? One of the most consistent markers of collapse is currency devaluation. In Rome, by the 3rd century CE, the silver coin known as the denarius had lost much of its luster. Once a trusted weight of real silver, it had become a shadow of its former self, filled with cheaper metals and stamped with symbols no longer respected. Bakers, merchants, and soldiers began refusing imperial currency. A soldier returning from the front might receive his pay, only to find he couldn't trade it for a loaf of bread. The empire responded by printing more coins, but more coins meant less value. And soon, inflation soared. This wasn't just a financial glitch. It was a breakdown of trust. Trust in money, in markets, in the state itself. This pattern appears elsewhere. In Han China, rising court expenses led to excessive minting and taxation. In Mesopotamia, grain used in barter systems was taxed and stored, but often spoiled in mismanaged state warehouses. When the farmers needed it most, the system failed them. So much of collapse begins not in war, but in imbalance. Take taxation. The wealthy, often closest to the court, found ways to avoid it. The poor, especially farmers, shouldered the burden. In Mauryan India, state officials meticulously recorded tax quotas, down to how many water wheels or fruit trees a village held. But when droughts came and crops failed, the taxes remained the same. Starving farmers paid with their land, then their freedom. The empire grew richer on paper, but weaker in spirit. And what of trade? Trade is a lifeblood. When it flows, cities thrive. When it clogs, entire civilizations feel the chill. Rome's vast network of roads and ships brought African grain to Italian shores, Egyptian papyrus to northern scribes. But when piracy rose and roads became unsafe, merchants stopped traveling, towns reliant on imports shrank, artisans lost work, ports filled with silence instead of sails. In Babylon, long-distance trade once connected the empire to regions as distant as the Indus Valley. But when borders grew unstable and conflicts with neighboring peoples rose, trade faltered. And with it the luxury markets vanished, along with the revenue that fed the palaces and temples. It is also no surprise that so many collapsing empires became militarily overextended. Rome again is a stark example. Endless wars drained the treasury. Veterans were promised land or pensions, but the funds ran dry. The state taxed more, the people resented more, and then, slowly, rebellions flickered into flame. An empire stretched too far, too long, without renewing its strength at the core, is like a tree with golden leaves and rotting roots. Even in the Islamic caliphates, during their periods of strain, border expansion sometimes outpaced the systems of tax collection, military provisioning, and governance. The consequence was the rise of local warlords, fractured loyalties, and crumbling cohesion. Another common thread is the neglect of rural and provincial populations. Cities, especially capitals, often continued to shine while the countryside suffered. In Rome, senators debated sculpture and philosophy in marble halls, while peasants bartered chickens for salt. In Han China, officials remained in their robes while distant villages collapsed from tax overload, famine, and banditry. The farther an empire strayed from the daily lives of its farmers, the closer it crept to instability. And at last, we come to one of the most haunting signs of all: cultural decline. Not in art or beauty, often these flourish in final moments, but in confidence, in the shared belief that the empire's story still made sense, that its gods still protected it, that its rulers were legitimate. When this story falters, when temples empty, rituals cease, and songs turn to satire, the collapse has already begun. We see this in late Sumerian texts that lament the gods have abandoned the cities. In Roman writings where nobles scorn the emperor as a distant shadow. In Chinese poetry that whispers of a once golden court now buried beneath weeds. When faith in the system breaks, not just religious faith but civilizational trust, the empire becomes brittle. So what do we see? currency weakened and mistrusted, unjust taxation and hollowing of the working class, trade disruption and over-reliance on distant networks, overexpansion without infrastructure to sustain it, neglect of local voices and needs, cultural disillusionment and spiritual silence. These are not stories from a single empire, they are a pattern etched into the bones of history. In the next part, we will step forward into our own time and ask a gentle but necessary question. Do we see these same patterns today? And if we do, what might they mean? Let us now return from the ruins of Rome, the ghost towns of Mesopotamia, and the sun-bleached roads of Mori in India, and turn gently toward our own time, not with alarm nor accusation, but with curiosity, with quiet eyes. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that decline is not always visible in fire or war. Sometimes it arrives like a shadow at dusk, slowly lengthening, barely noticed. And if we listen closely, we begin to hear the same warnings again. In many modern nations today, we see currencies under pressure. Inflation rises in cycles, sometimes triggered by crisis, sometimes by policy. Central banks print more money, the cost of living climbs, especially for those least able to absorb it. We are not minting silver denarii anymore, but the erosion of confidence in money, in institutions, in leadership, mirrors what ancient people felt when their coins stopped working at the market stalls. A loaf of bread that cost 1 coin now costs 5. Rent rises, but wages do not. Retirement funds feel uncertain, and just like a Roman merchant hiding his savings in grain rather than coin, people today turn to gold, to cryptocurrency, to anything they hope might hold value when systems wobble. This is not collapse, but it is familiar. In the background, global debt rises. Governments spend more than they collect, year after year, borrowing from the future to soothe the present. Again, not a collapse, but a trend that resembles what happened in Han China when court spending outpaced productivity, or in Sasanian Persia when wars drained the treasury dry. We are told it is manageable. And perhaps it is, but so too were the debts of yesterday's empires, until they weren't. Next, we must look at inequality, another pattern whispered across centuries. In many modern nations, the wealth gap between the richest and poorest has grown steadily for decades. Billionaires rise, owning more than entire countries. Meanwhile, middle classes stagnate, and lower classes struggle with housing, food, and healthcare costs. In Rome's decline, the same occurred. The senatorial elite grew richer, buying up rural land, evading taxes, living in excess. The poor, once protected by grain doles and public works, were abandoned. Social mobility froze, trust shattered. Sound familiar? Even in the Islamic Golden Age, when scholarship and trade flourished, periods of economic contraction saw power concentrated in fewer hands. When that balance tipped, the system began to crack. It is not wealth itself that signals collapse, but its distribution and whether the system still rewards effort or only status. Another echo lies in global interdependence. Once Rome's pride, now our own. We live in a deeply connected world. Goods cross oceans. Food, medicine, microchips all follow complex trade paths. This has brought astonishing growth, but it also brings vulnerability. When a single port closes, shelves go empty. When shipping slows, prices soar. When a war or pandemic disrupts one part of the chain, all others feel it. Whether it's the global pandemic or COVID in the United States, gun owners. This is not unlike Rome's later years, when grain from Egypt failed to arrive due to unrest and hunger spread in Italy, or when the Han relied too heavily on tribute goods from border regions that suddenly rebelled. We've built systems that are fast, efficient, profitable, but also fragile. Like the Roman roads, they are only safe until they are not. We must also speak of infrastructure decay. In many ancient empires, collapse was foreshadowed by neglected roads, broken aqueducts, crumbling city walls. Public works, once signs of power, became relics. Today, bridges age, water systems leak, power grids strain. In some countries, infrastructure is centuries old and barely maintained. The money exists, but the will to invest in what is shared, not privately owned, often withers. A Roman citizen could once walk under grand arches, bathe in heated public baths, and drink from public fountains. When these fell into disrepair, the city's spirit followed. Do we invest enough in what binds us together, or do we wait for cracks to become collapses? There is another parallel worth whispering about: disconnection between elites and ordinary people. Ancient rulers often surrounded themselves with luxury, advisors, and flattery. Distant from farmers and workers, they made policies that looked wise on scrolls but failed in field. Today, many governments face similar criticism. Urban planners who have never worked a farm, economists who speak in models, not meals, politicians who discuss inflation while citizens weigh the price of eggs. The ancient Han court once issued a rice tax increase during a drought. The result was rebellion, not because the people hated the idea, but because they had no rice to give. Economic collapse begins not with rebellion, but with the sense that those at the top do not understand what life is like below. Lastly, there is the erosion of public trust, the quietest and most dangerous echo of all. In Rome's twilight, citizens no longer believed the empire could protect them. In Babylon, prayers stopped, not because of atheism, but because the gods seemed absent. In failing empires, truth becomes scarce. Rumors thrive. Confidence, the glue that holds economies together, evaporates. Today we see this in distrust of institutions, conspiracy theories, political polarization, not everywhere and not always, but it simmers. Once people stop trusting their leaders, their money, their courts, their media, the system grows brittle, not dead, but vulnerable. And yet let us pause here. This is not prophecy. This is not panic. It is a reflection, a mirror quietly held up by history. Ancient empires fell not because they were doomed, but because they ignored the warnings. The signs were there, written in coin, in bread, in silence. In the next part, we will ask what they tried to do in response, and what, if anything, worked. Empires may fall, but they rarely go down without a struggle. Throughout history, rulers, advisors, and communities have all tried to reverse the tide of decline. They passed emergency edicts, altered trade routes, forgave debts, raised armies, printed new currencies. Some of these efforts worked, briefly. Others made things worse. Tonight, we look not only at collapse, but at response. What did the ancients do when their economic world began to crumble, and what can we learn from the tools they reached for, whether they splintered in their hands or held fast, even for a time? Let us begin, once more, in Rome. By the late 3rd century CE, Rome's financial system was in disarray. Inflation had spiraled out of control, coins were so debased they became meaningless. In response, Emperor Diocletian issued one of history's most famous attempts at economic control, the Edict on Maximum Prices. This sweeping law attempted to cap the prices of over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat to wine, from laborers' wages to legal fees. It was on paper a stunning act of regulation, but it failed. Merchants ignored it, farmers refused to sell at the fixed prices, black markets blossomed, people began hoarding goods. Instead of calming the economy, the edict fueled scarcity and fear. Rome's attempt to control the market by decree without addressing deeper causes like trust and supply was like placing a lid on a boiling pot. The pressure simply found new cracks. In contrast, the Islamic Golden Age, spanning the 8th to 13th centuries, offers examples of adaptive resiliency. During times of local famine or downturn, several caliphs established waqf systems, charitable endowments that supported everything from bread distribution to hospital services. Trade routes, though taxed, were generally secure and encouraged. When coin shortages hit in the Abbasid Caliphate, the state transitioned to paper notes, saku, and credit networks, reducing the need for physical currency in trade hubs. More importantly, knowledge was treated as a national resource. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad translated texts on finance, agriculture, and economics from across the known world. When crisis struck, responses were drawn not from panic, but from study. In Han China, one of the earliest experiments in government-stabilized food prices was launched during times of famine. The state created ever-normal granaries which stored surplus grain during years of good harvests. In times of drought or flooding, these granaries released food to stabilize the market and prevent starvation. The system wasn't perfect, corruption and mismanagement crept in, but when run well, it buffered rural populations from collapse. Likewise, land reform was an ongoing goal. Periodically, emperors tried to redistribute land from large landowners to struggling peasants. These reforms, such as the equal field system in later dynasties, were designed to prevent the rich from consuming all fertile land, a recurring cause of economic imbalance. Did they work? Sometimes, for a generation or two. But over time, aristocrats found ways to reclaim property. The reform spirit faded, and with it, the rural backbone of the empire began to crack again. In Babylon, responses to economic pressure were both spiritual and practical. Kings sometimes issued debt amnesties, known as clean slates, forgiving what was owed by peasants to the state or wealthy elites. These proclamations, etched into stone, were meant to reset society and prevent unrest. Imagine a farmer, crushed by loans, reading that his debts had been erased by royal decree. It was a form of economic and moral renewal, a rebalancing of the scales. But it came with a cost. Lending slowed, the elite resisted, and once kings grew weaker, debt cancellation became less common. When the balance of power tipped too far toward landlords, collapse returned. In the Mauryan Empire of India, solutions leaned toward bureaucratic control. The Arthashastra, a remarkable economic and political manual attributed to the advisor Chanakya, outlined how the state could regulate commerce, set taxes, control natural resources, and monitor corruption. Officials were assigned to every economic corner: mines, forests, herds, workshops. Markets had price checkers. Grain stores were tallied monthly. This intense oversight did help maintain imperial control during crises, but it also created a bloated bureaucracy. Inflexibility became a liability. When the treasury weakened and the bureaucracy faltered, the empire lacked local resilience. So what do we learn? What worked? Granaries and reserves, saving during abundance to survive scarcity, a timeless principle. Land redistribution, fair access to land bolstered rural strength, even if reforms were temporary. Debt amnesties, a powerful way to renew faith and relieve suffering, though politically risky. Charitable infrastructure, systems like WAC, sustained the poor and earned legitimacy. Knowledge-based policy, treating scholarship as a public good, provided stronger responses. Price fixing without reform, controlling prices without fixing root causes, only fed black markets. Currency debasement, short-term relief, long-term trust erosion. Tax burdens on the poor, over-reliance on lower classes for revenue-fueled rebellion and migration. Over-centralization, systems that couldn't adapt locally fell harder and faster. These responses tell us something profound. Collapse is not inevitable. It is a process, and it can be slowed, redirected, or even prevented if the response is wise, just, and rooted in the realities of daily life. But the moment those in power stop listening to the streets, the fields, the markets, that is when decline begins. In the next and final part, we will ask, what can we, today, learn from all of this? What kind of future do we build if we remember what the ancients forgot? We have walked the ruined roads of collapsed empires. We have sifted through clay tablets, brittle scrolls, and fallen coins. We've listened to the whispers of farmers and soldiers, traders and slaves, the ones who bore the weight of fading grandeur. Now, we step back into our own world. And the question lingers like incense in a cold room. What now? Because history is not prophecy. It does not repeat, but it does echo. And if we are willing to listen, those echoes can become warnings. Or better yet, instructions. The first lesson is perhaps the oldest. True strength lies in balance. Ancient empires that pursued endless expansion, economic or military, eventually snapped under their own weight. Rome spread from Scotland to Syria, but its wealth pooled at the center, while its edges bled. The Marians administered with surgical detail, but when local grievances were ignored, cracks widened. The lesson is clear. A system stretched too far without time to breathe or adjust becomes fragile. Modern economies chase growth with similar fervor. Quarter by quarter, year by year, the expectation is expansion. More output, more consumption, more returns. But nature has limits. People have limits. Soil depletes, water dries, patience wears thin. Growth is not the enemy, but growth without rest, without renewal, without reflection, leads not to prosperity, but exhaustion. Just as ancient systems collapsed from overreach, modern systems must find rhythms of sustainability, cycles of maintenance, of local investment, of pause. The second lesson is subtler, but just as vital. Public trust is more valuable than gold. Coins can lose value, roads can crumble, but when people stop believing in the system, its fairness, its future, that's when collapse accelerates. When Rome's money failed, people hoarded grain. When Babylon taxed too harshly, people fled cities. When Han officials stopped listening to their villages, rebellion brewed. Today we see similar tremors, distrust in governments, media, corporations, financial institutions. Not everywhere, not always, but growing. A stable economy isn't built solely on numbers. It's built on belief. Belief that taxes are fair, that justice is real, that work leads somewhere, that the future will reward those who endure. Once belief fades, no law or currency can restore it quickly. So the question becomes, how do we rebuild trust? By listening, by transparency, by protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them, by remembering that every economic policy lands in someone's home, someone's belly, someone's dreams. Third, we learn this: resilience grows from the bottom up, not the top down. The most successful ancient responses didn't come from grand reforms in palaces. They came from local systems that fed their people, that shared when others hoarded, that protected knowledge and tradition. In Han China, it was the ever-normal granary in a small town that kept thousands alive during a famine. In the Islamic world, it was local waqfs that fed orphans and students when governments faltered. In crumbling Rome, it was rural monasteries that preserved books, language, and seed grain. Today, this means empowering communities, not just corporations. Investing in local food systems, decentralized energy, public libraries, health clinics, education. These are not luxuries. They are lifelines. They are what endures when global supply chains snap or distant markets tremble. A resilient empire is one where every village matters. Fourth, fairness matters more than growth. Every empire that placed its burden on the backs of the poor while sparing the rich stumbled. In Rome, the senators grew fat on villas while farmers sold their children into servitude. In India, tax collectors demanded grain even when monsoons failed. In Babylon, elites shielded their wealth while the king begged the gods for calm. Modern societies risk repeating this mistake. When inequality grows unchecked, when loopholes favor the few, when the safety net unravels, it is not just a moral failing, it is an economic danger. Empires do not fall because the numbers go down. They fall because people give up. Equity is not charity, it is insurance against collapse. Finally, we must talk of memory. History is often written by victors, but collapse is lived by the forgotten. If we teach only the glory of empires and not their fragility, we miss the most useful part of the story. If we ignore the warnings carved in ancient stone, we risk walking into the same traps, with newer tools but the same blindness. What would it look like to build an economy that remembers? It would measure success not just in GDP, but in well-being, in food security, in mental health, in ecological health, in cultural preservation, in generosity. It would prepare for crisis not by hoarding power, but by training trust. It would reward repair, not just innovation. And it would know when to say enough rather than more. The ancients did not fall because they were foolish, they fell because they were human. They ignored the warnings, they closed their ears to the hunger of their people. They believed their greatness would shield them. We are not so different, but we have their stories, and that means we can choose another path. Let us end, not with fear, but with hope. An empire does not fall all at once, and perhaps it does not have to fall at all if it learns to listen to the quiet warnings written in grain, in coin, in trust. Thank you for listening to this long journey through time. May these echoes guide us toward something wiser. And so, dear listener, as the candles burn low and the world outside grows still, we leave behind the ruins of fallen empires. We've walked the salt-stained fields of Babylon, stood in the bread lines of late Rome, sat with scribes beneath the domes of Baghdad, and watched the last gold coins slip through Byzantium's trembling fingers. Each empire, mighty in its time, believed itself eternal, but time proved otherwise. What remained were lessons etched not just in stone, but in memory. Economies rise on trust. They fall through neglect. And while the names may change, the stories echo still. Thank you for staying with me on this long journey through the rise and fall of ancient wealth. I hope tonight's story brought not only reflection, but also rest. Before you drift into sleep, please remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into history's forgotten corners. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and how late it is there. It always warms my heart to see people tuning in from around the world. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.